Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I still feel shaken when I think about it, and it's been weeks since it happened. I ordered a new washing machine after my old one broke down. It wasn't the most exciting purchase, but I was looking forward to getting it set up and not having to drag my laundry to the laundromat anymore. I called the company, scheduled a delivery, and everything seemed normal. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, just get the machine, set it up, and move on. The delivery was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, and I was working from home that day. I made sure to be ready, figuring they'd come, drop it off, and be on their way. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The truck pulled up around 2 p.m., right on time. The delivery man was tall, wearing a uniform from the appliance company, and seemed friendly enough. He smiled at me when he got out of the truck, and we exchanged pleasantries as I showed him where I wanted the machine set up in the laundry room. I thought everything was fine. I really did. But then, after he unloaded the appliance, he said, "You mind if I come in and set it up for you?" I was a little taken aback because I hadn't expected it. I figured the company would just drop off the machine, and I'd have to handle the setup myself. But I didn't want to seem difficult. So I said, "Sure, I guess that would be helpful." I stepped aside to let him in. He carried the washing machine into the laundry room, set it down, and began looking around. He asked where the hookups were, which I showed him. Then, he started fiddling with the controls and asked me if I wanted him to connect it right away or if I'd rather wait. I said it was fine, go ahead, and I left him to it, figuring he knew what he was doing. That's when things started to get strange. As he worked, he began making small talk. It started innocently enough. "You live here alone?" he asked, glancing at me as I sat at the kitchen table, trying to get some work done. "Yeah," I answered, just trying to be polite. "It's just me." He nodded but didn't say anything for a while. Then, after a few moments, he added, "Do you have a boyfriend?" I looked up, surprised. The question seemed odd, but I brushed it off. "No," I said, trying to keep it casual. "Just not really into dating right now." He seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded as if he was making some kind of decision. But then he said, "I'm sure a pretty girl like you must have some guys after you." I didn't know how to respond to that. I'm not someone who gets a lot of attention, and the comment felt off. But I forced a smile and nodded, saying something like, "Not really." He didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he kept on working, but he started asking more personal questions. "Do you live alone because you want to? Or are you just, like, avoiding someone?" I felt my skin prickle. His tone was different now. It wasn't just small talk anymore. It felt like he was prying, trying to get more information than necessary. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just a little awkward, but he kept going. "You've got a lot of stuff here," he remarked, glancing around my house. "Do you live here alone? You seem settled." "I've been here a while," I replied, my voice getting tighter. I wanted to make him finish up and leave, but I didn't want to seem rude. Then, he asked something I really didn't expect. "Do you ever have people over? Or is it just you all the time?" The question made my stomach twist. It wasn't the kind of thing someone should be asking a stranger in your home. My mind raced for a way to end the conversation, but before I could respond, he added, "I don't want to sound like a creep, but it must get lonely sometimes, huh?" I froze. Something wasn't right. He was still working, but his body language had changed. He seemed more focused on me than the appliance now. I started to feel uncomfortable, like he was sizing me up, watching me too closely. I couldn't explain it, but I had this gut feeling that something was off. I tried to change the subject, making some excuse about needing to get back to work. But instead of just nodding and finishing the setup, he paused. He stood up straight and looked at me, not moving. There was something about the way he stared at me that made my chest tighten. "You're sure you're all right living here alone?" he asked again, his voice lower now. I can't help but wonder, sometimes people need help with things. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I could feel my heart rate picking up. I didn't like where this conversation was going, and I really wanted him to leave. But I didn't know how to tell him without being rude. He was in my house, and I didn't want to cause a scene, but I was scared. I could tell he wasn't going to leave anytime soon. I stood up abruptly, my voice firmer now. "Look, I appreciate your help with the machine, but I really need to get back to work. Can you finish up and head out?" He seemed startled by my change in tone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded and turned back to the machine, but I could tell he was stalling. He wasn't finishing up like he should have. Instead, he took his time, moving slowly as if he was trying to prolong the visit. "Almost done here," he said, but his voice sounded off. "Just need a little more time." I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to the door of the laundry room and opened it wide. "No! You need to leave now." He looked at me, his face unreadable for a second. Then, he grabbed his tools and walked out of the room without another word. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, just watching him walk out the front door. I didn't wait. As soon as the door closed behind him, I locked it. I didn't care if it was rude or not. I felt trapped in my own house. I don't know if he meant to harm me or if it was just an awkward, creepy encounter, but I was relieved when he finally left. The whole thing left me shaken. After that, I called the company to file a complaint. They were apologetic, but they couldn't really do anything since I'd already accepted the service. I've been extra careful ever since, making sure I don't let anyone into my house without a clear need. I don't know if I overreacted, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad could have happened if I didn't stand up for myself. I still get nervous when I hear someone knock on the door. It started like any other day. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails and preparing for a long afternoon of meetings. I work at a marketing firm, so the office is always busy and filled with people. But that day, it felt like something was off. Not in a big way, just a little nagging feeling at the back of my mind, like something wasn't right. Around 11:30 a.m., I noticed an envelope on my desk. It was plain, no return address, and the handwriting looked unfamiliar. I figured it was just some kind of promotional material or maybe something for work that had been misplaced. When I opened it, I was not prepared for what I found. The letter was short but detailed. It mentioned things about my personal life, things no one outside of my inner circle would know. It talked about my childhood dog, the house I grew up in, and even some of the places I liked to visit on weekends. It went on to say how it had been watching me, learning about my routine, and that it wanted to meet me in person. It was signed, "I'll be seeing you soon." At first, I thought it was a prank. Someone in the office must have sent it as some sort of joke. But the more I read it, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't funny. It wasn't even creative. It felt invasive and weirdly personal. I tried to shake it off, assuming it was some misguided attempt at humor, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the details in the letter were unsettling. The next few hours went by slowly. I kept looking around the office, half expecting to see someone watching me, but no one seemed to be acting strange. I tried to forget about it and focus on my work. That night, I went home and told myself I was overthinking things. I figured it was just some bored coworker with too much time on their hands. Maybe they knew I liked to visit the park on weekends or had overheard me talking about my childhood pet. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. The next day, I came into work and tried to put the letter out of my mind. But as the day went on, I started to feel like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was paying too much attention to me. I looked around, trying to figure out if anyone seemed off, but everything seemed normal. It was probably just paranoia, I told myself. Then, around lunchtime, I glanced out the window of my office, which overlooked the parking lot. And there he was. A man standing by a car, just staring at the building. It was hard to make out much about him from the distance, but his posture was strange. He didn't seem to be doing anything but watching the building. I figured it was just someone waiting for a friend or colleague, but I couldn't stop the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. I kept watching for a few more moments. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring up at the windows. My heart started to race as I wondered if it was him, if it was the person from the letter. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would be watching me, and yet here he was, out in the parking lot, doing just that. I turned away quickly, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I told myself not to make a big deal out of it. The rest of the afternoon felt like it dragged on forever. I kept glancing at the parking lot, but he was gone. I figured it had just been my imagination or a trick of the light, and I tried to focus on my work again. That evening, I got in my car and drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to keep my mind occupied on the drive, but I kept thinking about the letter, the man in the parking lot, and what all of it meant. The idea that someone might be watching me started to sink in, and the more I thought about it, the more it scared me. The next morning, I came in a little early to catch up on some work. It was still dark outside, and the office was quiet. I parked my car in the lot, glancing around nervously before heading inside. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there. When I got to my desk, something was different. There was another letter waiting for me. It was in the same plain envelope as before, and my stomach dropped when I saw it. I didn't even want to open it, but I knew I had to. This letter was worse than the first one. It didn't just talk about my routine, it referenced things I had never told anyone. It mentioned that it knew about my childhood home, the fact that I'd recently been to the local coffee shop, and that I had stopped by a bookstore the weekend before. It talked about how it had been following me, tracking my movements, and how it would soon be ready to introduce itself. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I looked out the window, half expecting to see that same man standing in the parking lot again. But there was no one there. That's when it hit me, he had been watching me the day before. And now, here he was, leaving letters for me. I started to feel trapped. Every time I walked outside, I felt like someone was following me. Every time I walked into the parking lot, I felt eyes on me. The worst part was that I didn't know who it was. Was it someone I knew? Someone from the office? Or was it a complete stranger? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched was consuming me. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe I was overreacting. But every time I looked out the window, I couldn't shake the fear that someone was out there. One day, I saw the man again, standing in the same spot, just watching the office building. This time, I could see his face. He looked familiar in an unsettling way, but I couldn't place him. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing control of the situation, like my life was no longer my own. I decided to talk to my boss about it, and they suggested I call the police. It felt like a huge step, but after what had been happening, I knew it was the right thing to do. The police took my report seriously and promised to look into it, but in the meantime, things kept escalating. The man was still showing up outside, watching me from the parking lot or lingering in the area, making me feel like I was always being followed. Eventually, after a few weeks of surveillance, the police were able to find out who he was. It turned out he was a former employee who had been let go from the company several months prior. He had apparently been harboring some kind of obsession with me, and he had been sending the letters and watching me for weeks. The police took care of it, and I haven't seen him since. It started like a regular Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished work, was feeling tired, and was getting ready to settle in for the evening. My phone rang at about 6 p.m., a number I didn't recognize. I thought it was probably a spam call, but I answered anyway. "Hello?" I said, not expecting much. The voice on the other end was shaky, panicked. "Is this Jeff?" "It's Mark, your cousin. I've been in a car accident. I'm hurt bad, and I really need your help." I froze for a second. Mark was my cousin, but we hadn't talked in a while. The last time I saw him was at a family reunion a few years ago. He seemed to be in a lot of pain. His voice was hard to recognize, and the urgency in his words caught me off guard. "Mark, what happened? Are you okay?" I asked, already reaching for my wallet just in case. "I don't know. I was driving, and some guy ran a red light. I don't have much time to explain. I'm at the hospital now, but I need money for the medical bills. I can't get out of here without it. Please, Jeff, I don't know what to do. They're saying I need to pay up front or they won't treat me. Please, I'm scared, man." I could hear him breathing heavily, and for a moment, it almost sounded like he was crying. I'd never heard him like this before, and I started to panic. Okay, just tell me where to send the money. I'll help you. Don't tell anyone," he added quickly. "I don't want anyone to know I'm in this mess. Just you. I trust you." His voice was full of desperation, and I couldn't think straight. I asked for his details, and he gave me the account number to transfer the money to. He said he'd explain everything when we could talk in person, but that he needed the money immediately or things would get worse. I didn't even hesitate. I sent the money. I just wanted to help, and I assumed it was a genuine emergency. I didn't think about how odd it was that I hadn't heard from him in so long, or that I'd never gotten a call from a hospital asking for money up front. I didn't think about anything other than getting him the help he said he needed. Once I transferred the money, I sat back, relieved. He promised he would call me again after he got out of the hospital, but he never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all that night. I assumed he was just dealing with the accident and the aftermath. The next morning, I woke up to a missed call from the same number. I checked my phone, and there was a voicemail from the same voice. "Jeff, it's Mark. They're saying I need more money. The bills are piling up, and I don't know what to do. Please help me out. I can't get out of here without it." I was confused. More money? I thought. He didn't say anything about more money the night before. But at this point, I was already too far in. I called him back. He picked up immediately, but this time, his voice was different. It wasn't the same frantic, scared tone from last night. It was colder, almost robotic. "Hey, Jeff," he said, like nothing had happened. "I need more. The doctors won't let me go without paying, and they're threatening to involve the police if I don't get them the money." "Wait, hold on," I interrupted. "What's going on? You said you needed money last night. Why are you asking for more?" There was a brief pause on the line before he spoke again, his voice still calm but with a hint of tension in it. "I'm not sure what's happening, but they're saying they can't treat me unless I pay up. I don't know what else to do. Please, I'm stuck here." I hesitated. Something felt wrong. The change in his voice from last night to now, the way he seemed to be more focused on money than his condition, it didn't sit right with me. I decided to look into it. "Mark, can you tell me the name of the hospital you're at? Maybe I can call them and confirm things," I said, trying to stay calm. There was another pause. Longer this time. No, I don't want you to call. Please, just send the money. I can't explain it all right now. Mark, this doesn't make sense. I'm calling the hospital, I said firmly. There was a long, tense silence before he spoke again. His voice sounded cold, almost threatening. "You better not," he said, in a voice that wasn't at all like his. "If you don't send the money, I'll make sure things get a lot worse for you. You don't want to mess with me, Jeff." I felt the blood drain from my face. The tone in his voice was completely different from the voice of my cousin. This wasn't Mark. It couldn't be. My mind raced as I started to realize what was happening. I hung up the phone and immediately tried to contact Mark's parents. I called his mother, but she didn't pick up. I left a voicemail asking if she'd heard from him, if he was really in the hospital. Then, I started Googling the hospital that Mark had mentioned. Nothing matched. I called the hospital directly, and they told me they had no records of him being admitted. I felt sick to my stomach. I went through everything again, trying to find any clue I had missed. I went back to the phone number. I Googled it. It was a prepaid phone, not linked to anyone I knew. That's when I realized I'd been scammed. But it didn't end there. For the next week, I kept getting calls from the same number. I blocked it, but the calls kept coming from different numbers. Sometimes it was the same voice, but sometimes it sounded like a different person altogether. They told me they knew where I lived. They told me they knew I was home when I wasn't. They threatened to hurt me, to hurt my family, if I didn't send more money. I had to get the police involved at that point. They told me it was a known scam, a common one where criminals pose as relatives in need of emergency funds. But the calls kept coming, even after I had reported it. They got more threatening, more aggressive. I changed my phone number, moved apartments, and took as many precautions as I could. But the feeling of being watched, of having someone track me, never really left. Even though I've been free from the calls for a while now, I still check my locks at night, still wonder if I'm being watched. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I thought I was careful. But this was different. It felt real. And for a while, it was my nightmare. I don't usually take detours, but it was late, and I was looking for a shortcut. I had been on the road for hours, heading back from a work trip, and I was just trying to make it home without falling asleep behind the wheel. My GPS had been guiding me through backroads I wasn't familiar with, but everything seemed fine, so I kept going. I figured I'd save a bit of time. The further I drove, the more isolated the area became. The trees seemed to close in around me, and there weren't many other cars on the road. It didn't bother me at first. I was used to driving long distances for work, but something about this particular stretch of road felt different. Maybe it was the emptiness. I hadn't seen another car for miles. That's when it started. My GPS suddenly gave a weird recalculating message, which wasn't uncommon, but when I glanced at the screen, it had started guiding me down narrower roads. Roads that looked more like dirt paths than anything else. I figured it was just a glitch, but it wasn't the first time my GPS had acted up. I pulled over to the side of the road for a second, just to check if the maps were updating correctly. I tried resetting the GPS, but the map was still showing me on some old trail through the woods. There was no way I was supposed to be on a road like this. I stared at the screen for a moment, trying to decide what to do, but then I heard a car approaching from behind. I wasn't too concerned at first. After all, I was on a road, even if it was a bit secluded. The car passed by, but it didn't seem to continue on. Instead, it slowed down, and I noticed it kept pace with me. I figured maybe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. I decided to keep going, thinking I'd hit a more populated area soon, and the GPS would correct itself. But the car behind me stayed right there, about 2 car lengths back. I tried to focus on the road, hoping that the GPS would find its way, but it just kept glitching. The further I drove, the more it seemed like I was heading deeper into nowhere. The road got thinner, and the trees pressed in closer. I could feel my heart rate picking up. This wasn't right. I was on some random country road now, and it was pitch black except for my headlights. The car behind me hadn't moved. It was still there, close enough that I could see its headlights in my rearview mirror, but not so close that I could see who was driving. I decided to pull over and let the car pass. Maybe it would help if I could just get some space. I signaled and slowed down, but the car didn't go around me. It slowed down, too, matching my pace. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked at the GPS again. It was still stuck on the same screen, showing me deep in the woods with no sign of civilization. The weird part was that the car behind me didn't seem to be in a hurry. It didn't pass. It just stayed there. And now I could see that the headlights were getting closer, and there was no other road or intersection to turn onto. I started to panic. I had no idea where I was. There were no streetlights, no houses, nothing. Just trees in this road that was becoming more and more like a trail than anything else. I felt like I was trapped in a maze. The car behind me, I realized, hadn't been overtaking me, but it had also been pacing me for miles, following me down this godforsaken road. It was too quiet now, too still. Something wasn't right. I sped up a little, hoping to put some distance between myself and the car. But it matched my speed, staying right behind me. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel its presence. The more I looked at the rearview mirror, the more I became fixated on the lights. It felt like they were the only things keeping me from slipping into complete darkness. It was as if this car had no intentions of leaving. My stomach churned. I pulled over again, this time a little more forcefully, trying to give myself more space. But the car didn't pass. Instead, it pulled over behind me, matching my stop. That's when my heart dropped. There was no one else on the road. No houses, no lights. Just the occasional rustling of wind in the trees. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced. I felt like I was being toyed with. What was going on? I stared at the headlights in my rear view, waiting for the car to either move forward or turn off, but neither happened. The lights just stayed there, steady and unwavering. I tried to ignore the panic setting in. I checked my phone. No signal. I couldn't call anyone. The GPS still wasn't working, still malfunctioning, telling me to keep going down this road, further and further into the woods. I couldn't take it anymore. I started my car, the engine roaring to life. I sped down the road, hoping that whatever was behind me wouldn't follow. The car was right there, still following, not speeding up, but keeping a steady distance. The road seemed to go on forever. The trees blurred past, and the sound of my tires on the gravel was all I could hear. I glanced in the rearview mirror again and saw the car had followed me even further, staying there like a shadow. I didn't know what was happening. The car behind me didn't seem like it wanted to pass anymore. It wasn't even trying to get ahead. It was just following. I drove faster now, my breath coming quick and shallow. My eyes flicked from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. I couldn't see where I was going anymore. The road was getting narrower and darker, and the trees on both sides seemed to press in on me. Then, suddenly, I saw a light in the distance. A building. A gas station. Something. I didn't care. I slammed on the gas and drove toward it, hoping to find something, someone, anyone who could help. When I reached the station, I skidded to a stop. I turned to look behind me. The car was gone. Just like that, it was gone. There were no headlights in my rearview mirror, no sign of it anywhere. I couldn't believe it. I pulled into the gas station, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. The car that had been following me was nowhere to be found, and there were no other cars around. I looked around. Nothing. The rest of the night was uneventful. I drove home in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I just narrowly escaped something. I don't know who or what it was, but I never want to experience anything like that again. It still makes me feel uneasy when I think about it. That car, staying right behind me for miles, not once trying to pass or move on. It was like they were waiting for something. I never thought something as simple as a leaky faucet could turn into a nightmare. It all started a few months ago. I was living in a small apartment in a city I had just moved to, trying to get settled into a new job. The apartment wasn't much, but it was affordable, and I figured it would do for the time being. It had all the basics: kitchen, bathroom, a small living room. But one day, I noticed that the faucet in the kitchen was leaking. Not a big deal, right? Just a minor inconvenience. I figured I'd let the landlord know, and they'd send someone over to take care of it. I sent an email explaining the issue, and within a couple of days, I got a response. The landlord told me the maintenance guy would be over to fix it. No big deal. I went about my usual routine, not thinking much of it. The guy who showed up to fix the faucet was named Rick. He was in his late 40s, a little scruffy looking, but he seemed harmless enough at first. He had a tool belt on and a kind of worn-out uniform, like he had been doing this for years. I showed him to the kitchen, and he got right to work. At first, everything seemed normal. Rick was friendly, chatting away while he worked, asking me about how long I'd been living in the building and how I liked the neighborhood. It felt like small talk, so I didn't think much of it. He even asked about my job, which I thought was a little personal, but shrugged it off. Maybe he was just trying to be friendly, I told myself. As he worked, he told me about some of the other tenants in the building. He mentioned how some of them had lived there for years, and how the building had changed over time. He was chatty, a little too chatty, but I didn't mind much. I thought he was just trying to pass the time while he worked. I went about my day, half paying attention to him while I did some other things around the apartment. When he was done, he told me everything was fixed and that I shouldn't have any more problems with the faucet. He gave me a smile and walked out the door. I thanked him and thought that was the end of it. But that wasn't the end. A week later, I woke up early one morning to the sound of a knock on the door. I groggily got up, not expecting anyone at that hour. When I opened the door, I found Rick standing there with a toolbox in his hand. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said. "I was just in the building doing some other work, and I thought I'd stop by and check on that faucet. Just wanted to make sure it's still working okay." I was taken aback. Why would he need to come by and check it again so soon? I hadn't had any issues with the faucet, but I didn't want to be rude. "Oh, it's fine," I said, trying to keep it short. "No issues at all." He looked a little disappointed, but he nodded. "Well, that's good to hear. But if you ever need anything, just let me know. I'll be around." I didn't think much of it, but something about the situation felt off. He was acting a little too familiar, like he had some kind of entitlement to be here. It was just a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. A few days later, I came home from work to find that the front door had been left slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but I assumed maybe I had just forgotten to close it properly. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked into the living room and noticed something strange. There was a half-empty cup of coffee on the coffee table. I hadn't made any coffee, and no one else had been in my apartment. At least, no one I knew. I was immediately on edge. It wasn't until I checked my phone that I saw a message from Rick. He had texted me earlier that morning. "Just checking in again. Hope everything's going well with the faucet. Let me know if you need anything." I was confused. I hadn't heard from him in days, and now he was texting me, and my apartment seemed to have been disturbed. Things started to escalate after that. Every time I came home, Rick seemed to be there, either lurking in the hallway or checking on something in the building. He always had an excuse, like he was fixing something in the basement or working on the plumbing in the unit next door. But I couldn't help but notice that he always managed to show up right around the time I was home. Then came the unannounced visits. I'd hear a knock at the door when I wasn't expecting anyone. I'd open it, and it would be Rick, always asking the same thing. "Everything still okay with the faucet? You need anything else fixed?" Sometimes he'd say he was just checking in, and other times, he'd ask if I had any other maintenance requests. The weirdest part was that he started asking questions about my schedule. "When do you usually get home from work?" he asked once, in an overly casual way. I gave a fake answer, but it felt wrong. I had never mentioned anything about my schedule to him, and yet, it was like he knew when I'd be gone and when I'd be back. One day, I came home to find Rick standing in the hallway, a little too close to my door. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded at him and tried to walk past. But he followed me inside. "Hey, I was in the building doing some work," he said, almost too cheerfully. "I thought I'd come in and check if you were still having any issues with that faucet." I was getting fed up at this point. "I'm fine," I said, trying to get him to leave. "There's nothing wrong with it. I told you before." Rick didn't seem to get the hint. He lingered, standing just inside the door with his toolbox in his hand. "Well, if you ever need anything, just call me. I'm always around." It wasn't until later that night, after I'd locked all the doors and double-checked the windows, that I realized how deep into my life Rick had inserted himself. He knew things he shouldn't have. Things about my routine, my schedule. It wasn't just the faucet anymore. He had crossed some line, and I couldn't figure out how to get him to stop. The next day, I called my landlord. I was frustrated, but I tried to keep it calm. I told them what had been happening, and they assured me that they would have a word with Rick. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was scared. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment anymore. Rick stopped showing up after that, and I didn't see him around the building again. But I'm always looking over my shoulder now, checking my locks, making sure no one's standing too close when I'm in the hallway. I don't know what he wanted or what his intentions were, but I've moved to a different building now. I can't shake the feeling that Rick is still out there somewhere, watching. And to this day, I can't forget how he always used to say, "I'm always around." I'm still trying to understand how it all happened. It's one of those things that seems like it can't possibly be real, but it is. It all started when I was living in the city, working long hours at a corporate job that I hated, trying to find some sort of escape during the few minutes I had for myself. I had a little routine where I'd go to the same coffee shop every morning before work to grab a coffee and sit in the corner, just to have a few moments of peace before the day started. One day, I noticed him. It wasn't anything huge at first, just a guy sitting across the room, glancing over at me every now and then. I didn't think much of it. People look around when they're bored, right? It's normal. But it felt different with him. I couldn't shake the feeling that his stares weren't just idle glances. It was like he was really studying me. I tried to ignore it, buried myself in my phone, scrolling through emails and trying to look busy. When I finished my coffee and stood up to leave, I glanced at him again. This time, he was still staring, but now it was more intense. It made my skin crawl. I felt my pulse quicken, but I shrugged it off. It's not like I was doing anything wrong, and maybe I was overthinking things. I didn't even look back as I walked out the door. The next morning, I went back to the same coffee shop, the same time, just like always. I ordered my coffee, and then I saw him. He was sitting at the same table, in the same spot. I tried to ignore him, but there was something about it, something about the way he sat there, just staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. I tried to distract myself, looking at my phone, but the feeling that I was being watched kept crawling up my spine. I remember feeling trapped, like he was in my personal space even though there was a table between us. It was as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge him. But I didn't. I just kept my eyes glued to my phone, heart pounding in my chest. After a while, I finished my coffee and left quickly, trying to shake the unease from my mind. This became a pattern over the next couple of weeks. Every morning, I would arrive, and there he would be, always in the same spot, always staring. It wasn't like he was doing anything outwardly threatening. He didn't smile, didn't try to engage me in conversation. He just sat there, eyes fixed on me. There were times when I almost thought he wasn't even blinking. And every time I left, he would be right there, watching me until I was out the door. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things. But then one day, I was late getting to the coffee shop, and I figured he wouldn't be there. But there he was, just as always. The same spot. I could feel my heart racing, my stomach turning. The thought crossed my mind that maybe I should stop going to that coffee shop, but I didn't want to let him chase me away. I didn't want to feel like I was letting him control my routine. So, I kept going back, hoping things would just return to normal. But things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. One morning, I was sitting there, sipping my coffee and minding my own business, when I felt that same, familiar sensation. The one that sends a chill down your spine. I glanced up, and there he was, right across from me, staring straight at me. For the first time, he didn't look away when I caught him looking. Instead, he just stared, as if daring me to say something, do something. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. It was like a game for him now. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I just sat there, feeling trapped in a chair that suddenly felt too small. He finally broke the silence, but not by speaking. He just smiled, a thin, creepy smile that didn't reach his eyes. My stomach lurched, and I quickly stood up to leave. I don't know why I didn't say anything. I don't know why I didn't call him out. Maybe I was just too scared, too shaken to speak. But I left, quickly, and when I glanced over my shoulder as I walked out, I saw him standing, watching me as I left the coffee shop. The next day, I came into the shop, dreading the sight of him. And there he was again, sitting in his usual spot, eyes on me the moment I walked in. I wanted to leave, to run out of there, but I forced myself to go to the counter and order. I figured if I just ignored him long enough, maybe he'd stop. But he didn't. And then, it got worse. I'd been sitting at my usual table, hoping that maybe I could get through the morning without having to deal with him, but that didn't happen. As I was scrolling through my phone, I felt a presence beside me. I looked up, and to my surprise, there he was standing beside my table, right next to me. He hadn't said anything. He was just there. I froze. "Hi," he said, his voice flat, like it had been rehearsed. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stared at him, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He smiled again, that cold smile. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. I shook my head quickly, panicking. No, thank you." Without another word, he simply nodded and walked away. But it didn't stop there. As I gathered my things to leave, I noticed him following me. He was right behind me, not too close, but close enough that I could feel him there. I quickened my pace, but so did he. I rushed outside, hoping to lose him in the crowd, but I could see him just a few paces behind me, walking steadily, like he had all the time in the world. I was almost to my car when I heard him call out. "You forgot your phone," he said. I turned around, my heart racing. He was standing near the entrance of the parking lot, holding my phone in his hand. I didn't want to go back to get it. I didn't want to get any closer to him. But I had no choice. I walked back, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. He handed me the phone with that same smile. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice still cold. I grabbed it from him and practically ran to my car, locking the door as soon as I was inside. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. It didn't make sense. This wasn't normal. I was terrified. I left the coffee shop for good after that day. I found another place to go, a little farther out, hoping that he wouldn't follow me. I didn't tell anyone what happened, didn't feel like I could, not without sounding crazy. I don't know who that man was, or what he wanted, but I never want to see him again. I still go to coffee shops, but I'm always looking over my shoulder now. I haven't been back to that one. I can't. The thought of him sitting there, staring, watching, it's still too fresh. I still can't believe it happened. I think about it all the time, especially when I'm driving late at night. It feels like it was all a bad dream, but I know it wasn't. It was real, and it could have ended very differently. I don't know why I got in his car, but I can't keep replaying that moment over and over, wondering what would have happened if I had made a different choice. It was a quiet evening, the kind where everything feels still. I had been driving home from visiting a friend, taking a long route through the back roads, just enjoying the peace and quiet. The roads were empty, and there were no other cars in sight. At first, everything seemed fine, but then I noticed my car slowing down. It sputtered once, then again. I could feel the engine dying, and before I could pull off the road, it stopped completely. I was stranded on this empty stretch of road, miles away from the nearest town, with no cell service. I sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. I thought about calling for a tow truck, but without any signal, I realized I was going to have to figure this out myself. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I had no other option. So I got out of the car and stood by the side of the road, looking for something, anything that could help. That's when I saw him. A car pulled up behind mine, a little too close for comfort, considering how isolated this road was. I felt a pang of unease in my stomach as the man stepped out of his vehicle. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and dark hair. He looked like he had been driving for a while. At first, I wasn't sure if I should trust him, but he smiled and said, "Looks like you're having car trouble." I nodded. "Yeah. My car just died, and I don't know what's wrong with it." He offered to help, and I didn't want to seem rude, so I said okay. He popped the hood and looked inside for a few minutes, muttering to himself, but not really doing much. He wasn't a mechanic or anything, and I could tell he didn't really know what he was doing. He looked over at me and said, "This is going to take a while. I don't think you'll be able to fix this on your own. You'll need a garage." I agreed, hoping that maybe he knew where one was nearby. That's when he suggested that he could drive me there. I hesitated. I had heard stories about things like this happening, about people pretending to be helpful, but then doing something horrible. But he seemed genuine enough, and I didn't want to be left alone in the middle of nowhere. I figured I'd be fine, so I agreed. Big mistake. He asked me to get in his car, and I did, though I kept my bag on my lap, just in case. We drove in silence for a while. At first, everything felt fine. He wasn't talking much, just focusing on the road, but the longer we drove, the more uncomfortable I became. The car was old, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The silence between us stretched on, and I felt this growing tension. I started to look around, trying to distract myself, but all I could focus on was him. After a while, he started talking. It wasn't anything normal, just small talk at first. "So, what's your name?" he asked. "Where are you from?" I told him my name, and I mentioned the city I lived in, but I didn't want to go into too much detail. I could feel his eyes on me more often now. He was glancing at me in the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering too long. It made me nervous. Then, he said something that caught me off guard. "You're a pretty girl. You must have a lot of people after you." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to respond. I felt my stomach tighten. He wasn't smiling anymore, just staring at the road, but the way he said it felt off. Too personal. I thought about asking him to pull over, but I didn't know where we were, and I didn't want to make him mad. What if he got angry? What if something worse happened? The car kept going, and I started to wonder just how far we were from any kind of civilization. My phone had no signal, and the road seemed to be getting more desolate. I kept glancing at the GPS, but the map wasn't helping much. It was just a blur of lines. After a few minutes, the man spoke again. "You know, it's pretty late. I'm not sure if the garage will still be open." My heart started to race. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, there's a little place up ahead," he said, but I can always drop you off at my place if you're tired. I'm sure I could take a look at your car tomorrow morning." The way he said it made my blood run cold. He was asking if I wanted to go to his house. I quickly told him that I just needed to get to the garage, that I didn't want to impose. But he just nodded and didn't respond, though I could see the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. That's when I realized we were driving further and further into a part of the road I didn't recognize. It wasn't a place where I felt safe. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, but I didn't know how to do it without making things worse. I started looking for an opportunity, any opportunity to escape, but all I could see were empty fields and dark stretches of road. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You know, I've been watching you for a while. I've seen you before, a few times." I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You don't remember me?" He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You were at that diner last month. You looked really good in that red dress." I didn't know what to say. I hadn't seen him before. At least, I didn't think I had. The memory of him, the thought of him following me, made my skin crawl. I had to do something. I couldn't let him take me wherever he was planning to take me. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. We were still a long way from any sort of town, but I managed to muster up the courage to tell him I needed to use the bathroom. It was a lie, but I knew I had to get out of that car. He pulled over reluctantly and told me to hurry. I stepped out of the car, heart pounding, and without thinking, I started walking away from him. I didn't look back. I didn't care if he followed me. I just kept walking. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I saw a light in the distance. It was a house, and I ran to it. I knocked on the door and begged for help. The people inside let me in, and I never went back to that road again. I don't know if he followed me, but I haven't seen that man since. I still feel uneasy sometimes when I drive alone. I always make sure my doors are locked and my phone is fully charged. And I never, ever let a stranger take me anywhere. This all started about 3 weeks ago, and I still can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. It's hard to explain it all without sounding paranoid, but I swear something was off from the moment I started getting those letters. It all began on a Wednesday. I came home from work like any other day, exhausted and ready to relax. When I checked my mailbox, I noticed an envelope that looked out of place. It wasn't like any of the usual bills or junk mail. It was just a plain, white envelope with no return address. My name was written on it in what looked like a rushed, barely legible handwriting. At first, I thought it was just some random letter, maybe a misplaced piece of mail. I opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper. The note read, "I saw you at the grocery store today. You were in the cereal aisle, picking out the same brand as always. I like that one too." I didn't know what to make of it. It felt weird, sure, but there was no reason to panic, right? I shrugged it off. Maybe someone just had the wrong idea, or maybe it was a weird coincidence. So, I threw it away and didn't think much of it. Then, the next day, another letter showed up. Same thing, no return address, just my name on the front, and that same strange handwriting inside. This one was even more unsettling. It read, "Yesterday, you wore your blue jacket when you left your apartment. You always wear that jacket on chilly days. I bet you like how it feels." I froze when I read it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. How could someone know that? I hadn't seen anyone nearby when I left my apartment, and I didn't think I'd ever been noticed by anyone that closely. But again, I tried to brush it off. It could still be a coincidence. Maybe someone was just paying a little too much attention. The next letter came a few days later. This time, it was even more specific. It said, "On Tuesday, you had lunch at the park near your building. You sat at the bench by the fountain and spent almost an hour reading that book you always carry. I saw you. You looked relaxed. This was different. This was starting to feel like someone was actually following me." I could feel my heart race as I held the letter in my hands. But I was still too afraid to admit it out loud, to face the fact that someone might actually be keeping track of my every move. Still, I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe someone was just watching me and guessing things about my routine. Maybe they were just paying too much attention to everything I did. But things kept escalating. The next letter mentioned something that shook me to the core. It said, "Your friend Sarah visited you yesterday afternoon. You two talked for over an hour. You shared stories about your childhood, and you laughed when she told you about her new job. It's nice to see people so happy." I had barely told anyone about Sarah coming over that afternoon. We just sat on the couch, talking about random things, but how could someone know that much? I hadn't seen anyone watching, I hadn't heard anything strange, but the details were so specific. My gut was screaming at me that this wasn't a coincidence anymore. The letters didn't stop. Over the next week, I received 3 more. One of them described me walking to my car in the morning. Another mentioned how I'd stopped at the coffee shop down the street for my usual order. One even talked about my jog in the park on Saturday, how I'd paused to stretch by the playground. How could someone know all of this unless they were watching me constantly? I started to get paranoid. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling like I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I looked around, convinced someone was following me. I checked behind me when I walked to my car, and I started avoiding places where I'd been mentioned in the letters. I couldn't even enjoy the peace of my own home anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. It wasn't just the letters anymore. I began to notice strange things around my apartment. At first, it was subtle. My shoes were out of place, the towel in the bathroom was folded differently, or the TV remote was moved just a little bit. Small things that made me question my own sanity. I thought maybe I was just forgetting things, or maybe I was imagining things. But the letters kept coming, and the sense of dread grew with each one. I was too scared to tell anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I didn't want to worry my friends or family. But it got worse. One day, I was sitting on my couch when I got another letter. I opened it, and for the first time, it mentioned something I had never told anyone. "You've been thinking about moving lately. I can see why. Things aren't as comfortable as they used to be. You're probably wondering if you should stay in this place or find somewhere new. I understand." That was it. I snapped. How could someone know that? I hadn't even told my best friend, let alone anyone else, that I was thinking about moving. It was just something I'd been mulling over, nothing concrete. But someone knew. Someone had been watching me. They knew everything. The thought of someone being so close, observing my every move, made my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whoever was behind this. I started going through the letters one by one, looking for any clues. I checked the stamps, the type of paper used, the handwriting, anything that could give me a hint about who this person was. But it was all too clean, too anonymous. No return address, no sign of where they were coming from. One night, as I sat by my window, looking down at the street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, across the street, standing in the shadows by a tree, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way they stood still, unmoving, staring at my building, made my heart skip a beat. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with a million questions. Had they been watching me all along? Were they still out there? I grabbed my phone and called the police, but when they arrived, they couldn't find anyone. There was nothing on the surveillance cameras, and the streets were empty. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I haven't received any more letters since that night. I moved out of my apartment a few days later, and I haven't looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I can't shake the feeling that someone's still watching. I don't know if they ever stopped or if they're still out there, but I hope they don't find me again. It was just a regular Friday night. I had been out with a couple of friends at a bar nearby. Nothing too wild, just a few drinks and a lot of laughing. It had been a long week at work, and I was looking forward to just getting home and putting my feet up. Around 2 a.m., I called a rideshare to take me back to my apartment, like I usually do when I'm out late. I didn't think anything of it at first. The car pulled up just a couple of minutes after I requested it. The driver was a man in his mid-40s, I'd guess, with a friendly smile and a clean car. I didn't really get a bad vibe from him at first. He greeted me when I got in, asked how my night was, and we talked about the usual things, like where I was going and how the traffic was that night. He was polite and seemed like just another driver, so I settled in and relaxed. The first few minutes of the ride were fine. I was just scrolling through my phone, checking texts, minding my own business. But then, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I noticed he wasn't taking the usual route to my apartment. I didn't think too much about it, though. I figured maybe there was a detour or construction on the road, or maybe he knew a shortcut that I didn't. I didn't say anything, just kept scrolling on my phone, still in a bit of a haze from the night out. But then, a few more turns that didn't make sense. He was taking streets I didn't recognize, driving farther and farther from my neighborhood. At this point, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. I glanced up from my phone to look around, trying to figure out where we were. I didn't recognize any of the streets we were passing. The area was getting quieter, darker, and it felt like we were driving into a more industrial part of town, away from the residential area where I lived. I started to feel a little uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my stomach twisted. I tried to remain calm, thinking maybe it was just a mistake, or maybe he was taking a detour for some reason. I asked, "Hey, where are we going?" "This isn't the usual route." He smiled back at me in the rearview mirror, like it was no big deal. "Oh, there's a bit of traffic up ahead," he said, his voice friendly. "Just taking a quick detour." I nodded, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But the detour was lasting longer than I was comfortable with. I kept checking the time, realizing that I had been in the car much longer than it should have taken to get home. I started to feel a little panicked, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe I was just being paranoid. So, I tried to distract myself again by looking at my phone. But I couldn't stop noticing that we were still heading further out of the way. At this point, I could feel my heart racing, and the small talk from the driver wasn't helping. I could tell he was still looking at me in the mirror, though his smile had faded a little, replaced by a kind of focus that didn't sit well with me. I cleared my throat and said, "I'm really not sure where we are now. Can you just take me back to the main road? My apartment's on, street name if you're lost." He didn't respond right away. I heard him mumbling under his breath, like he was considering something. The streetlights were sparse now, and the area felt more deserted. There were fewer cars, fewer people. I could hear the soft hum of the tires against the road, but there was something in the air that made it feel too quiet. "I'm almost there," he said finally, but his voice sounded too calm, almost rehearsed. I frowned, but before I could say anything else, I reached for the door handle, just wanting to get out of this weird, uncomfortable situation. I figured maybe I could find my way back, but as I reached for the handle, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The door was locked. I froze for a second, confused. I thought maybe I had just hit the lock by accident. But I tried again. The handle wouldn't budge. My heart started racing. I glanced at the driver in the mirror, and now I could see the smile on his face was gone. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, and his expression was stiff. Something felt deeply wrong. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't help myself. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "I need to get out of the car. Let me out." He didn't reply. Instead, he just continued driving, like I wasn't even there. The silence between us grew heavy, and I could feel my chest tightening. I kept trying the door handle, but it was still locked. I started to feel like I couldn't breathe. The air in the car was getting thick, and the lights outside seemed to be flickering as we drove deeper into the industrial area. "Please, open the door," I begged, my voice growing frantic. "This isn't funny." The man didn't even glance at me. He was still driving, his eyes fixed on the road. But then, after a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and almost calm. "You shouldn't be worried," he said. "It'll be fine." I felt like I was going to lose it. This wasn't fine. It didn't feel fine. I was trapped in the back of his car, and I had no idea where we were going. No one else was around, and I couldn't even see anyone in sight. The panic was rising in my chest, and I needed to get out of this car, but there was nothing I could do. I kept pulling at the door handle, but it didn't give. I glanced out the window, searching for any sign of life, any way out. But there was nothing. I could see dark buildings and empty lots, and the streetlights flickered above us like they were malfunctioning. That's when I heard him again. This time, he spoke more slowly, like he was savoring the words. "You don't have to be scared. I just need to make sure you're okay. We're almost there." The way he said "almost there" made my blood run cold. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to act fast. I didn't even think about it. I just reached down and grabbed my phone from my bag. I dialed 911 without thinking. The operator picked up immediately, and I was so frantic I couldn't even speak at first. But I managed to get the words out. "He's not stopping. He's locked the doors and won't let me out. Please, help." The operator stayed calm, asking for my location, and I tried to focus, looking for any landmarks I could see outside. I gave her the best description I could, but the whole time, I kept trying to get the door open. Then, the car slowed. The man took a turn into a parking lot. That's when I knew I had to do something. Without thinking, I kicked the door hard. It was locked, but I slammed my foot against it with all my strength. And somehow, it popped open. I didn't even look back. I just bolted. I ran as fast as I could into the dark streets, not looking back. The operator stayed on the line, and I kept running until I saw a car passing by. I flagged it down, desperate, and the driver stopped. They let me in, and I gave them my phone so I could tell the 911 operator I was safe. The police were able to track down the car and arrested the driver. They found that he had done similar things to other women in the past. I don't know how long he had been doing this, but I'm just grateful I got out when I did. I still get nervous every time I take a rideshare now. I try to make sure I'm always aware of my surroundings, and I double check that the door is unlocked before I get in. I can't shake the feeling of how close I came to something terrible happening. And I can't forget that night, how it felt to be trapped in that car, not knowing what was going to happen next. I never thought much about my neighbors. I've lived in the same apartment for a few years now, and the walls are thin, so you get used to the usual noises, people walking, a door slamming, music playing softly through the walls. It's just city life. But then, about a month ago, I started hearing things that made my skin crawl. At first, it was subtle. It would happen late at night, when everything was quiet. I'd be in bed, almost asleep, when I'd hear a soft thudding sound coming from the apartment next door. At first, I thought it was just someone dropping something or moving furniture, but it didn't stop. It would go on for hours, sometimes getting louder, almost like someone was pacing back and forth, but without any real pattern. The noises started getting more disturbing after a while. I started hearing scraping sounds, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The sounds were erratic, almost like something was being knocked over, followed by the sound of quick footsteps. I tried to ignore it for a few days, telling myself it was just a neighbor doing something at odd hours, but it started to affect me. I couldn't sleep. The noises were getting too consistent, too strange. One night, around 2 a.m., the sound of dragging and shuffling woke me up again. I had enough by that point. I got dressed, threw on my slippers, and decided to knock on my neighbor's door. I wasn't sure if I should, but I had to ask what was going on. I knocked 3 times, waited a moment, and knocked again. I was about to give up when I finally heard footsteps approaching from the other side. The door opened just a crack, and I saw the face of my neighbor for the first time. He was a man in his early 30s, tall, thin, and wearing a gray hoodie, his eyes wide and a little tired looking. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice a bit shaky, like he was startled. I cleared my throat and said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been hearing strange noises coming from your apartment at night. It's been going on for a while now, and it's making it hard to sleep." He looked at me for a second, and then his face softened, like he was trying to be understanding. "Oh, I'm sorry about that. It's just, I've been moving some stuff around. You know, rearranging things. It's probably just the furniture being shifted." I nodded, not entirely convinced, but I didn't want to push it too hard. "Okay. I just thought I should mention it. It sounds a little strange sometimes, like something's dragging or being knocked over." He smiled awkwardly. "I get it. I'm really sorry. I'll try to keep it down. I'll be more careful with the furniture. Thanks for letting me know." I smiled back, still unsure, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. "All right, thanks. Good night." He shut the door, and I went back to my apartment. That night, the noises didn't come. For a couple of days, things seemed normal. But then, a week later, it started again. This time, it was worse. There was that dragging sound, then what sounded like a heavy object falling to the floor, followed by a weird, muffled thumping. It went on for hours, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was losing sleep, feeling paranoid, and I couldn't get the thought out of my head. What is going on over there? I decided to knock again. It was late, probably around midnight this time. I had barely knocked once when the door opened. He was standing there, still in the same gray hoodie, his eyes wide, but now with a strange, almost nervous energy. "Oh, it's you," he said, sounding surprised but not upset. "Is everything all right?" I can hear it again, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The noises. It's still going on. And it's getting worse. I just don't understand what's happening. He shifted his weight uncomfortably and glanced around, like he was looking for an escape. Yeah, sorry about that. It's just... I've been doing some repairs in the apartment. Fixing stuff, you know? I told you I was moving things around, but I guess it's just louder than I thought. His explanation didn't make any sense. I'd lived here for years, and I knew that building. Repairs don't sound like that. I knew what tools and noises came with repairs, and this wasn't it. There was a weirdness to the way he said it, like he was being evasive, like he didn't want to tell me something. I'm not sure I believe that, I said slowly. This isn't just furniture or repairs. It sounds like something's being dragged. Like someone's pacing more. I said I'm sorry. I'll do my best to keep it down, he interrupted quickly. Don't worry about it. I hesitated for a moment, looking at him. He wasn't making eye contact, and his hands were fidgeting in his hoodie pockets. I didn't want to press him further, but I had this sinking feeling that something wasn't right. Okay, I said, backing away from the door. But if it doesn't stop, I'll have to let management know. This is becoming a problem. Of course. I understand. I'll take care of it, he said, still not looking me in the eye. I didn't feel any better. There was something off about him, but I didn't want to escalate it. I walked back to my apartment, but the unease stayed with me. The next day, I was in the kitchen when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was already late in the evening. I opened the door, and there he was again, standing awkwardly in the hallway. Hey, he said, forcing a smile. I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay with the noise and everything. I didn't want you to feel uncomfortable. I can hear you sometimes through the walls, too, and I didn't mean to disturb you. I felt my heart race. I had only spoken to him twice, yet now he was knocking on my door for no reason, checking on me. It didn't feel right. I took a step back, trying to keep my voice calm. I'm fine. Just, please keep the noise down. I don't need any more late-night disturbances. Of course. Of course, he said quickly. But then he added, if you ever need anything, or if the noise keeps up, you can always come to me. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Thanks, but really, it's fine. Just keep it down. As I closed the door, I could see him standing there, still smiling that weird, forced smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me more than a neighbor should. The next few days were a blur, with him showing up uninvited twice more. The first time, he just stood outside my door for a few minutes, then knocked and asked if I was okay. The second time, he lingered in the hallway, pretending to check his mail but glancing at my apartment door every few seconds. It didn't take long for me to realize the noises weren't just random anymore. He was making them. I don't know why or what his intentions were, but I knew that I wasn't going to wait around and find out. I started staying with a friend for a few nights and reported his behavior to the building manager. Eventually, the landlord got involved, and after some investigation, it turned out that the man had a history of strange behavior with previous tenants. I don't know exactly what went down, but after a few weeks, he was moved out. I still live in the same building, but every now and then, I hear noises at night, and I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. I've learned to trust my instincts now, and I always keep my door locked, just in case. I don't usually go to the doctor unless I have to. I'm not someone who worries about my health too much. But lately, I've been feeling a little off, nothing major, just some weird aches here and there, and thought I'd go in for a routine checkup. It had been years since I'd seen a doctor, and I figured it was about time. I found a new clinic near where I lived. It seemed pretty standard, clean, modern, nothing unusual about it. The receptionist was friendly, asked for my details, and said the doctor would be with me soon. I sat in the waiting room, flipping through a magazine, trying not to think about the fact that I was about to get poked and prodded by a stranger. When my name was called, I stood up and followed the nurse to the examination room. She didn't seem anything out of the ordinary, just a quick hello, and then left me alone with the clipboard full of forms. I filled out the usual stuff: medical history, family history, current medications. Nothing too exciting. A few minutes later, the doctor came in. I had only seen him in passing before. He was tall, in his mid-40s, maybe? Dark hair, a little messy, but he had a warm smile. I guess he tried to look reassuring, but there was something about him that felt off. "Hello, Mr. Grant," he said, shaking my hand. "How are we feeling today?" "Just a bit off, nothing serious," I said, trying to sound casual. "I've been having some aches and pains here and there, so I figured I'd get checked out." "Nothing to worry about, I'm sure," he said with a smile. "Let's get you comfortable and take a look." He motioned for me to sit on the examination table, and I did as he asked. He asked a few basic questions about my health, how I'd been sleeping, what I ate, whether I exercised regularly. All the usual questions you'd expect at a checkup. But then, he asked something that threw me off. "Are you married?" he asked, leaning a little closer than necessary. I nodded, feeling a little uncomfortable. "Yeah, been married for about 6 years now." "Do you and your wife spend a lot of time together?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was fishing for something specific. I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hide the confusion from my voice. He looked at me for a second, like he was thinking. "Well, relationships can sometimes affect your health. You know, stress, intimacy, things like that. I just want to make sure everything is okay with you." I wasn't sure how to answer. I had never been asked anything like that during a routine checkup. "Yeah, everything's fine," I said, brushing it off. "No problems." He nodded, but his gaze lingered a little too long, and then he quickly moved on to the next question. "Have you ever had any issues with anxiety or depression?" At this point, I started to feel like I was being interrogated. I mean, who hasn't? "But no, I don't really deal with anything like that," I said, shifting uncomfortably on the table. He didn't seem to let it go, though. He took out his stethoscope and listened to my chest, then asked, "How about your family? Are you close with them?" I stared at him, confused and slightly unnerved. Yeah, we're fine. I see them for holidays, birthdays, that sort of thing. But I'm not really sure how that's relevant to a checkup." His eyes softened, but not in a comforting way. More like he was studying me, trying to figure something out. "Well, you'd be surprised how much family dynamics can affect your health, Mr. Grant. I just want to make sure we're covering all bases here." I wasn't sure if I should be getting up and leaving, but I didn't want to make things awkward. I just wanted to finish the exam and get out of there. He continued with the examination, but his questions kept veering into uncomfortable territory. He asked about my childhood, how my parents treated me, whether I had any issues with my upbringing. The whole time, I felt like he was prying too much. It wasn't just medical anymore, it was personal. Really personal. When he moved to take my blood pressure, he asked, "Do you ever have trouble sleeping at night?" Do you ever wake up in the middle of the night? Maybe thinking about things. I could feel my face getting flushed. This wasn't normal. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I mean, sometimes I wake up if I'm stressed, but that's about it, I said, trying to make light of it. He nodded, but I noticed that his hand lingered a bit too long on my wrist. His grip was firm, almost unnervingly so, like he was waiting for something, testing something. I could feel my anxiety rising. Have you ever thought about your health in terms of mortality? He asked, his tone turning a little softer, more conversational, like we were having some deep, philosophical discussion. I blinked, not sure what he was getting at. I mean, sure. Everybody does. But I'm fine. It's just a routine checkup, right? He didn't seem to hear me. He just stared at me for a moment longer, then smiled again. Right. Just routine. Everything looks good here. I'll have the nurse come in to finish up, and then you're free to go. But don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything else. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. He had spent way too much time asking about things that had nothing to do with my health. And the way he looked at me, like he was studying me for some deeper purpose, felt wrong. The nurse came in a few minutes later to finish up the rest of the routine stuff, and I quickly dressed and left. I didn't even say goodbye to the doctor. I just wanted to get out of there. On my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that whole appointment. His questions had felt like an invasion of privacy, like he wasn't just checking my physical health, but something else. It felt like he was trying to get into my head, dig into personal details of my life that didn't belong in a medical setting. I didn't want to go back to that doctor. I wasn't sure if what had happened was intentional, or if he was just an odd guy, but I knew I wasn't comfortable with it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, what if he had been doing this to other people? What if he was using his position to manipulate people, to cross boundaries without anyone noticing? I didn't want to find out. So, I found a new doctor, one that I felt comfortable with, and I never went back to that clinic. But I haven't stopped thinking about that appointment, or the way he made me feel like I was being watched. And I wonder sometimes if maybe, just maybe, it wasn't an accident. I had never been a fan of street performances, but a friend of mine convinced me to go to one. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the street was filled with people wandering about, enjoying the sunlight. A man was performing near the park, juggling and doing tricks that seemed to draw a crowd. I didn't expect much, just figured I'd stop by for a few minutes to kill time, maybe grab a coffee afterward. I leaned against a nearby wall, watching him for a bit. His performance was impressive, he was good with his tricks, and the crowd seemed entertained. But there was something about him that caught my attention. It wasn't just the way he moved or how skilled he was at juggling, it was the way he kept making eye contact with me. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just performing to the crowd, trying to make everyone feel like they were part of the show. But every time I looked away, I could feel his gaze on me, and when I looked back, his eyes were locked onto mine. It wasn't like he was being subtle about it, either. It was intense, almost too intense. It made me uncomfortable. After a few minutes, I figured it was time to leave, so I walked away and headed toward the cafe nearby. But as I walked, I could feel my heart racing for no reason. I told myself it was just the anxiety of being in a crowd, but something about that moment stuck with me. The next morning, I was at my usual cafe. It was a quiet Sunday, not many people around. I ordered my coffee and found a seat near the window. I wasn't expecting to see anyone I knew. But when I looked up, I saw him. The same man from the street performance was sitting at a table near the back. He was looking right at me, not in a casual way, but in the same way he had looked at me the day before. I froze for a second, unsure if I should make eye contact or look away. But he didn't look away. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, just like they had on the street. It felt like my chest was tightening. I got up quickly and left, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he liked this cafe too. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me somehow. The next day, I went to the gym. It was early, so the place was mostly empty. I did my usual workout, tried not to think too much about what had happened over the last few days. I didn't see him at first, and I told myself that maybe I was just overthinking everything. But then, as I was stretching on the mat near the back, I glanced up and there he was, standing by the weights, watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, just like the last 2 times. I didn't know if I should be scared, angry, or confused. My stomach turned. I tried to keep it together and not let it show that I was uncomfortable. But it was hard. I finished my workout quickly and left without really paying attention to what I was doing. I was in a daze, just wanting to get out of there. I convinced myself that he had just been a regular person at the gym. I tried to make excuses. But when I walked out, he was standing outside the gym, watching me. I didn't want to make a scene, so I hurried to my car, my heart racing. I locked the doors as soon as I got in. I tried to breathe, to calm myself down, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every place I went, he seemed to be there. I went to the grocery store, he was standing by the checkout. I stopped by a different cafe, he was sitting at a table near the window, staring at me. One day, I was walking out of my workplace, and I saw him across the street, leaning against a building, watching me. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It was like he was following me, waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge him. And each time, he would look at me with that same intense gaze. It felt like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a move, to say something, to respond. But I had no idea what he wanted. I started taking different routes home, avoiding the places I usually went. I didn't know if it was paranoia, but I started to feel like I was being watched constantly. Every shadow, every stranger's glance, felt like it could be him. It became harder to ignore. One night, I decided to go out with a friend, hoping that a change of scenery would take my mind off things. I went to a bar in a different part of town, a place I'd never been before. It was busy, but I figured the crowd would make me feel safer. I wanted to forget the last few days, to just have a normal night. But as soon as I walked in, I froze. There he was, sitting at the bar, as if waiting for me. He turned and looked directly at me, that same intense gaze. My stomach dropped. I didn't know how he had found me, but there he was, like he had been there all along, like I was the one who was being followed, not the other way around. I couldn't handle it anymore. I told my friend I wasn't feeling well, and we left immediately. As we stepped outside, I turned to look down the street one last time. He was standing across the road, just standing there, staring at me. It was like he had been waiting for me to leave. I didn't know what to do. I didn't feel safe anymore. I started to think about moving, changing my routine completely, getting as far away from this man as I could. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step ahead of me. I don't know if he ever stopped following me, but after that night, I started avoiding going out at all. I didn't want to go to the places I used to visit, and even when I did go out, I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. He was always somewhere in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I stopped seeing him after a while, but the feeling never went away. I don't know if he was just a strange man with too much time on his hands, or if he was something more, but I haven't been able to forget about him. Every time I see someone glance at me a little too long, I get nervous. I keep thinking about those eyes, always watching, always waiting. It happened a few months ago, but I still think about it almost every day. I'm a college student, and I've been babysitting for a while to make some extra money. One evening, I got a call for a regular babysitting job. The family I usually worked for lived in a nice neighborhood, so I wasn't worried about the safety of the place. I arrived, met the parents as usual, and they left for their dinner date. Everything was normal. The kid I was watching, Ethan, was a sweet boy, around 8 years old. We watched TV for a while, and then he went to bed like he always did. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The parents had told me they would be back by 10, and it was about 9:30 when my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw the number listed as Dad on the caller ID. I thought nothing of it, maybe he was just calling to check in, but I answered. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Hey, this is Ethan's dad," the voice on the other end said. It was deep, but something about it felt a little off. "How's everything going?" "Everything's fine," I replied. "He went to bed about 20 minutes ago. Should be asleep soon." Good, he said. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Hey, I just wanted to ask you something real quick." "Sure," I said, a little confused, but still calm. I was wondering if Ethan's been acting strange lately. Maybe, more quiet or distant. Has he been doing anything unusual? I was a little taken aback by the question. I mean, Ethan was a quiet kid, but I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. No, not really. He's been fine. Just like usual. Okay, he said, sounding a little too relaxed. That's good to hear. How's the house? Everything all right? The house is fine, I said, starting to feel a little uneasy. Nothing wrong with it. Another pause, longer this time. The man's voice dropped, and he asked, "Have you checked the locks on the doors?" I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew I had locked the door when I got in. In fact, I'd even checked again when Ethan went to bed just to be sure. "Yes, the doors are locked," I said, trying to sound normal. "Everything's fine." Okay, just making sure. You never know with these things. The conversation was starting to feel a little strange, like he was asking me about the house as if he was trying to make sure something was still in place. My mind started to race. Why was he asking these questions? Was it just concern, or was there something more going on? Is Ethan okay? I asked, trying to bring the conversation back to him. I mean, why are you asking about all of this? Well, like I said, just checking in. Just want to make sure everything's all right, he replied. There was something about his tone that felt off. Like he wasn't being fully honest. Okay, well, everything's fine here, I said, trying to cut the conversation short. I was about to hang up when he spoke again, his voice a little quieter now. Listen, he said, lowering his voice. I'm gonna be home in about 10 minutes. But I need you to do something for me before I get there. I didn't like where this was going. What's that? Check the windows, he said. Make sure all of them are locked. Every single one. My heart began to pound in my chest. I told myself it was probably nothing, that maybe he was just worried because it was late. But it felt too strange. I didn't want to make a scene, but I felt the urge to end the call. Still, I didn't want to seem rude. "Okay, I'll check them," I said, trying to stay calm. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, everything's fine. I'll be there soon." "Just check the windows, all right?" he repeated. I agreed, though my mind was racing. I was starting to feel paranoid, but I got up and began walking around the house. I checked the windows in the living room, the kitchen, and the dining room, making sure they were locked. I moved through the house quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. When I checked the last window in the back, I froze. There was something off about it. It was locked, but the curtain was slightly pulled back, just enough to see someone standing on the other side of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell who it was, but they were standing still, just staring at me through the window. I quickly pulled the curtain back into place, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand shook as I pulled my phone out again to call the police, but before I could do anything, my phone rang once more. The number on the screen read Dad. I took a deep breath before answering, trying to sound calm. "Hello?" "Hey," the man said, but his voice didn't sound right. It was lower now, almost rasping. "You checked the windows, right?" I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. The person standing outside couldn't have been the father, could it? The voice on the phone didn't match what I heard outside. "Yeah, I checked," I said, trying to sound confident. But the truth was, I was terrified. "Everything's fine." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then he said, "You sure?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaking. "I'm sure." "I'll be home soon," he said. "Just don't let anyone in, okay? Don't answer the door for anyone but me." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, even though he couldn't see me. As soon as I hung up, I bolted for the front door, locked it again, and grabbed my phone. I called the parents, but the line went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do next. The situation felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. After a few long minutes, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked through the blinds, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone walking toward the front door. My heart stopped. But then, I saw the headlights, and a car pulled up to the driveway. The real father. I felt the tension leave my body as I unlocked the door and opened it. "Everything all right?" he asked, walking in. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him about the call, about the man on the phone, but I didn't. It was just too weird. He looked at me curiously but didn't ask any more questions. I didn't babysit for that family again. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, or worse, pretending to be someone else. I still don't know what happened, but I didn't feel safe in that house after that night. This happened about 6 months ago, and it's been on my mind ever since. I don't usually post about personal stuff, but this experience shook me to my core, and I feel like I need to get it off my chest. I was selling an old camera I had lying around. It was a decent one, but I didn't use it anymore. I put up an ad online, offering it at a fair price. I wasn't expecting much trouble. A couple of days later, I got a message from someone, let's call him Mark. He was interested in buying it, and after some back and forth, we agreed to meet in person at a local park. It was a public place, well lit, and close to where I lived, so I figured it'd be fine. I've done plenty of online sales before and nothing ever went wrong. We agreed to meet around 3 p.m., right by the park benches near the walking trail. The park wasn't too busy at that time, but there were enough people around that I didn't feel uncomfortable. I arrived a bit early, just in case. I brought the camera with me in a small bag, and I was just sitting on one of the benches, waiting. I saw Mark about 10 minutes later. He was walking toward me, looking around as if trying to spot me. He was tall, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap and a hoodie. He looked normal enough, and I didn't think anything was off at first. He waved when he saw me, so I stood up and waved back. "Hey, you the guy selling the camera?" he asked, sounding casual. "Yeah, that's me," I said, holding out the bag. "It's in here, just like I said in the ad." He didn't take the bag right away. Instead, he stared at me for a second, his eyes scanning me up and down like he was sizing me up. "You're the one who put it up for sale, right?" he asked again, his tone a bit sharper now. "Yeah, it's me," I said, trying to keep things light. I wasn't sure why, but something about the way he was looking at me made me feel a little uneasy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some cash. I figured this was the part where I'd hand over the camera, and we'd be done with it. But instead, he started counting the money, slowly, one bill at a time, like he was trying to double-check something. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke again. "This doesn't seem right," he said, a frown on his face. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "This camera, it's not the one you showed in the pictures," he said, his voice growing louder now. "You said it was in perfect condition, but this looks used." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had taken care of the camera, but sure, it had a few scuffs. I was honest about that in the ad, though. I wasn't trying to scam anyone. I mean, it's a little used, but it works fine. "You can check it if you want," I said, offering it to him. I figured if he tested it, he'd see I wasn't lying. He didn't take it. Instead, he slammed the cash down on the bench and glared at me. "You're scamming me, aren't you?" he spat. "What?" "No," I said, taken aback. "I'm not scamming you. Look, the camera works perfectly. It's just a little used, but that's all. You can check it before we do anything. I'm not trying to hide anything." But he didn't listen. His face turned red, and he stood up so suddenly that it startled me. "You're lying," he shouted. "You said this was in perfect condition. I've got half a mind to just take it and walk off right now. You've already taken my money, haven't you?" I froze. I don't know why, but something about the way he was talking made me feel like I was in danger. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation, but I wasn't about to let this guy just take the camera from me. "Listen, I'm not trying to rip you off," I said, holding my hands up to show I wasn't looking for a fight. "I said it's a used camera, but it works fine. You can test it if you want." But Mark didn't listen. Without warning, he lunged at me, grabbing the bag with the camera in it. I wasn't expecting it at all, and I stumbled back, trying to pull the bag away from him. My heart was racing, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. "Let go of it!" I shouted, struggling to keep my grip on the bag. He yanked harder, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about the camera anymore. He wasn't interested in a fair exchange, he was angry, and he was trying to intimidate me into giving up the camera. "Just let go," he yelled, trying to jerk the bag out of my hands. I had to think fast. I couldn't let him just take it. I was stronger than he looked, so I pulled back harder. But then, to my shock, Mark reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out something, maybe a knife or a small object. I couldn't see exactly, but I knew it was sharp by the way he held it. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to find out what he would do next. "Back off!" I shouted, backing away quickly. I was trying to get distance between us, but I could see the anger in his eyes. It was like he was willing to do whatever it took to get that camera, and I wasn't sure if he'd stop at just a threat. Then, I noticed something. People had started walking by, and a few of them were looking in our direction. I don't know why, but it seemed like the moment Mark saw other people, he hesitated. I didn't wait for him to make another move. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the main road. My heart was in my throat as I heard Mark yell something behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. I was too scared to even look. I ran straight to the nearest store and ducked inside, my chest heaving. It took a minute to catch my breath, but I was safe. I knew that much. I don't know what Mark was planning or why he reacted the way he did. All I know is that I'm never selling anything like that again. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't gotten away still haunts me. That wasn't a normal transaction, and I don't think I'll ever forget the look in his eyes. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I've always considered myself cautious, but looking back now, I realize I might have been too trusting. This all started a few weeks ago, and I've had trouble shaking it off since. It all began when I started walking to work. I live in a small town, and the commute is short, maybe 20 minutes on foot. It's a nice walk through some quiet streets and a couple of parks. I've always enjoyed the morning air, the calm before the day starts. I'm one of those people who likes to get up a bit earlier than necessary, so I had the streets mostly to myself. One morning, I noticed a white van behind me as I walked. It wasn't anything too unusual. There are plenty of vans around here, especially with construction work and delivery trucks. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been following me for longer than a simple coincidence. It kept pace, staying a few car lengths behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a van on a route, like the others. The next day, it happened again. I noticed the same van, white with no markings, right behind me. Same time, same place. Again, I brushed it off, but this time, I started paying a little more attention. As I walked, I tried to glance back casually, and I noticed that the van didn't seem to be going anywhere else. It just stayed there, following me down the street. The third day was when things started to feel strange. I decided to change my route to see if it was just a coincidence. I took a different street, one I usually don't use in the mornings. To my surprise, the van was still behind me, a few blocks away. It had followed me down the new street. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way it could just be a coincidence now, right? That night, I thought about it, tried to reason with myself. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably a delivery van, I convinced myself. Maybe it was just in the area. But I couldn't shake that feeling, the one you get when something doesn't seem right. I still had to walk to work the next day, so I tried to ignore it and focus on getting to the office. But the next day, it happened again. The same white van was following me. This time, I stopped for a moment and tried to look back without making it obvious. I saw the driver clearly for the first time. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just driving slowly, as if waiting for me to move. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. There was no way I could keep pretending it was a coincidence. I decided to confront him. The following morning, I waited until I was a few blocks from my office. I made sure to glance back, and sure enough, the van was still there. I waited until we were at a stoplight and then turned sharply down an alleyway that led to a less busy street. My idea was to get off the main road and see if the van would follow. It did. It followed me down the alley, then onto the quieter street. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. I wanted answers. I didn't stop walking, but I turned onto a side street where I knew there was a busier corner with people around. I glanced back, and there it was again, the van, still following me. I took a deep breath, then made my move. I quickly crossed the street and stood in front of a small cafe, pretending to look at the menu posted outside. As I waited, I saw the van slowly drive by, the driver turning his head to look at me as he passed. I knew this was my chance. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and started walking toward the van, trying to act calm, like I knew exactly what I was doing. The van slowed down and eventually stopped. The driver rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. I tried to sound confident as I asked, "Why have you been following me for the past few days?" His expression didn't change. He just stared at me for a moment, as if sizing me up, then shrugged. "I'm just in the area. I'm working nearby." "Working where?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. He shifted in his seat, but I could tell he was getting nervous. "I work for a delivery company. You know, just driving around. Nothing special." I didn't buy it. The van had no markings, and I couldn't see any delivery equipment inside. It looked like a plain, white van with tinted windows. "You've been following me for days. That's not normal." He just smiled, a bit too wide, like he was trying to stay calm. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just a coincidence. You're making a big deal out of nothing." I stood there for a moment, staring at him. There was something about the way he was acting that made my skin crawl. His eyes weren't right, there was a coldness to them that I didn't trust. It felt like he was lying, but I couldn't pin it down. My hands were shaking now, and I realized I needed to get away from him. "I don't believe you," I said, taking a step back. "I'm calling the police if you don't leave." The man hesitated for a moment, then started to roll up the window. "Fine, whatever," he said, his voice suddenly sounding annoyed. "You're crazy." And with that, he drove off. I watched the van disappear down the street, my heart still racing. I stood there for a while, trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know who he was or why he was following me, but I had a horrible feeling that he wasn't going to stop. I called a friend as soon as I could, and I told her everything. She suggested I talk to the police, but I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously. After all, I didn't have much proof, just a feeling that something was off. But I couldn't keep living like this, so I filed a report anyway, just in case. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't seen the van again. But I still don't feel safe. Every time I leave my house, I check my surroundings, and I still sometimes feel like I'm being watched. Maybe I'm paranoid, but I know I can't just forget about this. I don't walk the same route to work anymore. I change it up every day now, just in case. And I'll never forget the look in that driver's eyes. This happened about 2 months ago, and I still feel uneasy thinking about it. I had just moved into a new apartment, and it was my first weekend alone since the move. It was late, around 10:30 or 11 p.m., and I didn't feel like cooking. So, I decided to order some food. I went online, picked something quick, and ordered it. I knew the place was close by, so I expected it to be here in 30 minutes or less. I had my couch all set up for a relaxing night, Netflix queued up, blankets ready. I figured I'd have a quiet evening to myself. When the app showed my food was out for delivery, I didn't think much of it. But 45 minutes went by and no one showed up. I checked the app again and it said the driver had arrived at my apartment complex. I thought that was weird since no one had knocked yet, but I figured maybe they were just finishing up something. I gave it another 10 minutes and then I got a call. It was the delivery driver. "Hey, this is Mike from restaurant name. I'm downstairs, but I can't find your apartment." I felt a little frustrated but tried to stay calm. "I'm in, building name, apartment, number. Just come up to the second floor and turn left. It's right there." "Oh, okay, great. I'll be up in a minute." I waited for a couple more minutes, and when I heard a knock at the door, I got up and opened it. The man standing there was in his late 30s, average build, wearing the usual delivery uniform. His hair was messy, and he was holding the bag of food. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but there was something about the way he stood in the doorway that made me feel a little off. "Hey, sorry it took so long," he said. "It's been a long night, you know how it is." I nodded, "It's fine, no problem." But then he stepped forward, and before I could react, he asked, "You want me to bring the food inside?" I wasn't expecting that. It was late, and I was tired. I didn't really want him hanging around, but I didn't want to be rude either, so I just said, "Sure, I guess. Thanks." He walked in, setting the food down on the counter, but he didn't leave. He started taking off his jacket, even though it wasn't cold in the apartment, and then looked around like he was checking the place out. I thought maybe he was just one of those overly friendly people, but I could tell something was off. "Nice place you got here," he said, walking around like he had all the time in the world. "Ah, thanks," I replied, trying to keep things casual. "I just moved in a couple of weeks ago." He nodded like he was really interested, but his eyes lingered on things in the apartment longer than was normal. He was taking in the details too much, like he was inspecting the space. After a few seconds of awkward silence, he said, "You alone?" I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't like I had a problem with answering simple questions, but it felt strange. "Yeah, just me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ah, I get it. I'm the same way," he said with a chuckle. He walked over to my kitchen counter where I had placed the food. "You know, I could make you a drink if you want. Like a soda or something," he said, looking over at the fridge. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, hoping he'd take the hint. But instead of leaving like I thought he would, he stayed where he was. "Yeah, I get it. You probably don't know me, right? I mean, I've been doing deliveries for a while now. People don't always trust a stranger, I get that." I just smiled awkwardly, hoping he'd finish his business and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he started moving around the apartment like he was making himself comfortable. "So, what kind of stuff do you like to do for fun?" he asked, his voice now sounding much more familiar, like we were old friends. I wasn't sure how to respond. I felt uncomfortable now, like I had invited a stranger into my home and couldn't get rid of him. He was starting to stand too close for comfort, and his presence was overwhelming. "I'm just gonna eat now," I said, trying to take control of the situation. "It's getting late, so I really need to get some sleep after this." His face didn't change, but there was this moment where his eyes seemed to harden. It wasn't a look of anger, but something more unsettling. "I'm sure you don't want to eat alone," he said with a grin that made me feel even more uncomfortable. "I don't mind keeping you company while you eat." "No, That's okay, I said quickly, stepping back toward the door. I really need to. Before I could finish, he reached into the bag of food, pulling out the drink I had ordered. You didn't get a drink, huh? Let me make it easier for you. At that point, something in my gut just snapped. I knew I needed him to leave, now. I walked to the door, keeping my back to him, and opened it. I really need you to go now, I said firmly, my voice trembling just slightly. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he looked at me for a moment with that same weird smile and said, "All right, well, if you change your mind, just let me know. I'll be around." I didn't even respond. I just stepped back and closed the door behind him. My heart was pounding, and I locked the door immediately, then leaned against it for a few seconds to catch my breath. I had a weird, anxious feeling in my chest, and I couldn't stop thinking about how he'd lingered inside my apartment for way too long, how he tried to act so casual, like he wasn't crossing lines. The next morning, I thought about calling the delivery service to report him, but then I worried I might be overreacting. What if it was just a weird coincidence, or maybe I was just paranoid? I don't know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I don't order food anymore at night. I don't want to risk something like that happening again. I still don't know if I should have done more, but I don't think I'll ever forget that night. It felt like I was in danger, but I didn't know why or from what. All I know is that it was one of the scariest moments I've ever had. I've been walking my dog every evening for years now, same route, same time. It's part of my routine, and honestly, it's something I look forward to. My dog, Charlie, is a golden retriever, so he loves it too. There's a park nearby, and I usually just go around the block and let him sniff around. It's never been anything special, just a quiet walk. A few weeks ago, though, something happened that's made me rethink even stepping outside after dark. It started on a Tuesday evening. The sky was getting that deep, dusky color, and I had Charlie on his leash as usual. We were just about to turn onto the main road when I noticed a woman walking toward me on the opposite side of the street. She had a small dog, a little terrier, which was trotting along beside her. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another person out with their pet. As we got closer, she smiled and waved, and I returned it out of politeness. She then said, "Your dog is really cute." "What's his name?" "Charlie," I said, holding up the leash slightly so she could see the dog's face more clearly. "Nice to meet you, Charlie," she said in this friendly, high-pitched voice. Then she took a step closer, and her dog gave a little bark in Charlie's direction, which made Charlie wag his tail and do that little dog thing where they both try to figure each other out. "Where do you live?" she asked casually, and I remember it catching me off guard a bit. I don't usually share that kind of detail with people I meet on walks, but it wasn't like she was asking for my address, just something vague, so I didn't think much of it. "Just a few blocks down that way," I said, pointing down the street, trying to keep the conversation light. I figured she was just being friendly. "How about you?" "Oh, I live just around the corner," she said, waving vaguely in the direction of a different street. "I don't think I've seen you around before. How long have you been in the neighborhood?" I told her I'd been living here for a couple of years. She nodded like she was processing that, then her eyes seemed to drift over my house for a second, but I didn't think much of it at the time. She asked a few more questions about my house, if I liked the neighborhood, if I had lived here long, what brought me to the area. I answered as best as I could without getting into anything too personal. It all seemed innocent enough, though I did feel a little weird with how much she wanted to know about my routine. After a few more minutes of small talk, she said, "Well, it was nice talking to you and Charlie. Maybe I'll see you again." I nodded and waved her off, and she turned and went down the side street, her dog trotting behind her. At the time, I thought it was just a friendly conversation. But over the next couple of days, things started to feel off. The following evening, I took Charlie out for our usual walk, but I noticed something strange. As I walked down the road, I caught a glimpse of her across the street, standing in the shadows of a tree. I wasn't sure if it was her at first, but when she stepped into the light, I could see her clearly. She was watching me. Just standing there, staring. I didn't think much of it at first. People go for walks, sometimes they just stand and look at things, right? But then I saw her again the next day, in the same spot, looking right at me as I walked by. I could have sworn she was waiting for me to pass by. By the third day, I started feeling uneasy. She wasn't just standing there anymore. This time, she was sitting on a bench, holding her dog in her lap, staring directly at me as I walked Charlie. I waved, but she didn't wave back. She didn't even acknowledge me. I started to feel that creeping discomfort, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just waiting for someone or passing the time. But then, it happened again. The next evening, she was there once more, standing at the corner of the street, watching me. It was like she was always there, at the same time, at the same spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching my every move. I started to hurry past, trying not to look at her. But one evening, when I was almost home, I glanced over and saw her standing across the street, staring at me again. I could feel my pulse quicken, my mind starting to race. I turned to look at Charlie. He was still his usual self, but I could tell something wasn't right. His ears were perked up, his tail wasn't wagging, and he kept glancing back at me like he knew something was wrong too. I decided to turn down another street, taking a longer route home, hoping I wouldn't see her anymore. But as I looked back, I saw her standing in the distance, right where I would have walked past. She wasn't just standing anymore, she was walking slowly toward me, her eyes locked on mine. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time in a long while, I felt afraid. I could hear the sound of my footsteps on the pavement, the distant hum of cars passing, but everything felt so still. I picked up my pace, turning corners quickly, trying to distance myself from her. But I could feel her eyes on my back, following me. I didn't look back again after that. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I finally reached my apartment. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and drew the curtains. I didn't go outside for the rest of the night. It's been a few days since that happened. I've been keeping an eye out for her, but I haven't seen her again. I don't know if I'm just paranoid or if something's wrong, but I can't shake the feeling that she's been watching me for longer than I realized. I've tried telling a few people about it, but they don't seem to think it's a big deal. Maybe it's nothing, but I don't know. I can't forget those eyes staring at me, following me, like she was waiting for something. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe walking down that street again. I'll start by saying I don't know why I didn't leave earlier. I should have. Something about the whole night felt off, and I should have listened to that gut feeling. It all started when my friend Alex invited me to a party at his place. He was having a bunch of people over, and I didn't really know most of them, but I figured it would be a decent way to spend my Saturday night. I hadn't seen Alex in a while, and he always throws pretty chill get-togethers, so I was looking forward to it. When I arrived, the house was packed. People were laughing, music was playing, and everyone seemed to be in their own groups. I didn't recognize many faces, but it wasn't a big deal. I didn't mind hanging out by myself for a bit. I grabbed a drink and started chatting with some people I kind of knew, but it didn't take long for me to notice this one guy standing off to the side. At first, I thought maybe he was just shy or maybe he didn't know anyone, but as the night went on, it became clear that he wasn't just quietly observing like I initially thought. He wasn't talking to anyone, not even making eye contact. Just standing there, kind of blending into the background, but in a way that made you notice him. It was like he was trying to be invisible, but not in the way you'd expect someone to blend in. He was off. I found myself glancing over at him a few times, not sure what to make of it. I'd seen people like him at parties before, the ones who don't seem to fit in, who just kind of stand there, not knowing how to engage. But he wasn't even looking at anyone. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or doing anything normal. Just standing still, watching. I figured he was just weird, maybe a little socially awkward. But it made me uncomfortable after a while. So, I decided to get away from the crowd for a bit and went to use the bathroom. The bathroom in Alex's house was down the hall, past the kitchen, away from where most people were hanging out. I didn't think much of it when I walked in and started washing my hands. But as soon as I heard the bathroom door creak open, I froze. It was the guy from earlier. He didn't knock or say anything, just walked in like it was normal. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I should say something or just ignore it. He didn't seem like the type who would be in a hurry, so I figured he was just waiting for me to finish. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stood in the doorway, looking at me. Not with curiosity, but like he was waiting for something. I felt this strange chill run through me. Can I help you? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I was hoping he'd just say something and leave. But instead, he stepped forward and closed the door behind him. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind was racing. I didn't know this guy, and it wasn't normal for people to just lock the door behind themselves in someone else's house. Why are you here? I asked, my voice shaky. I was trying not to sound scared, but I could feel my heart pounding. The guy didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if he was serious or if he was just strange. He didn't seem dangerous at first, but the way he was standing there, like it was all a game to him, made me nervous. I was just wondering, he began, his voice soft but persistent. How long have you known Alex? I blinked. I don't know, a few years. We met in college. He nodded, but then he took another step toward me. I took a step back without thinking. I didn't know what he wanted, but I didn't want to be alone in a locked bathroom with him. Do you live around here? He asked, his voice becoming more focused. It was like he was studying me. The questions were so random, so out of place. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out if I could make a run for it or if I should say something to get him to leave. But he wasn't letting up. He kept asking more and more personal questions. Do you like this neighborhood? Do you walk your dog here? Do you live alone? What do you do for work? The questions kept coming, one after another, each one stranger than the last. I could feel my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I could feel myself getting more and more uncomfortable. This was way beyond casual conversation. Look, I don't know you, I finally said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I think you need to leave. I moved toward the door, but he didn't step aside. No, he said, his voice suddenly cold. I just need to understand. It's important. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stand there and let this happen. I took a deep breath and pushed past him, slamming my shoulder into his chest as I opened the door. Hey, he shouted, but I didn't stop. I ran down the hall and straight out the front door, not even bothering to look back. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't dare slow down. When I got outside, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I don't know why, but something told me if I hadn't gotten out of there when I did, I might have ended up in a situation I didn't want to be in. My heart was still racing, and I could feel my legs shaking. I didn't even care about the party anymore. I texted Alex and told him I had to leave. He tried to convince me to stay, but I wasn't having it. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy, about his cold stare, about the way he wouldn't let me go. I haven't been back to Alex's house since. And every time I think about that guy, I feel sick to my stomach. I don't know what his deal was, or why he was asking me all those questions, but I have a feeling I don't want to know. All I know is I'm never going to a party there again. I don't know why I didn't feel right about it at first. It was a regular trip to the grocery store, nothing out of the ordinary. I needed some things for dinner, some snacks for the week, and just the usual staples. I wasn't even thinking about it when I walked into the store, but then, a few minutes in, I noticed him. At first, I figured he was just another shopper, someone who was just there for the same reason I was. It was a small store, and sometimes you run into the same people in the aisles. But this guy? He kept showing up, always in the same aisle, always just a little too close. I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But after a while, I started noticing how often he was around. I'd turn a corner, and he'd be there. I'd reach for a can on the shelf, and his hand would be right there next to mine. It was like he was following me, but in a subtle way, like he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just enough to make me uncomfortable. I went down another aisle, thinking I could get away from him. I grabbed some frozen food and tried to focus on that, but I could feel his presence again. I looked up, and there he was standing at the end of the aisle, just looking in my direction. I quickly turned my head, pretending I hadn't noticed him, but my heart was starting to race. I kept moving through the store, trying to shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I picked up a few more things, kept my head down, and focused on getting through the trip. I didn't want to let it bother me, but I kept seeing him out of the corner of my eye. He was always there, a little too close, but never directly approaching me. Finally, I made my way to the checkout. I was hoping to just pay for my things and leave, get in and out of there as quickly as possible. But of course, when I got to the counter, he was already there. I hadn't noticed him at first, but then he stepped up behind me in line, and I felt my skin crawl. He looked at my cart and said, "Quite the haul there, huh? Looks like you've got everything you need for a week." I felt a chill run through me. He was standing a little too close. I turned around and gave him a quick, polite smile, hoping he'd get the hint. "Yeah, just the basics," I said, trying to sound casual and not make a big deal out of it. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially not with someone who'd been following me around the store. But he didn't take the hint. He kept talking, asking if I lived nearby, if I was shopping for a family, if I worked in the area. The questions kept coming, one after another, and I tried to give as little information as possible without being rude. I didn't want to draw attention to myself or make a scene, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he was trying to size me up. I kept my responses short, nodded politely, and hoped the transaction would move along faster. When my things were finally bagged up and the cashier handed me my receipt, I turned to leave. I felt a strange sense of relief, like I was escaping. But when I got outside and walked to my car, I saw him again. He was standing near the entrance, just standing there, watching me. I froze for a moment, trying to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for his own car. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. But then I noticed he started walking in my direction. Slowly. I tried to stay calm, reached for my keys, and unlocked my car. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if something was really wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. As I got closer to my car, he spoke again. "Hey, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable earlier. I just thought we could talk. You know, it's not often you meet someone with such good taste in groceries." I didn't respond. My heart was pounding, and my instincts were screaming at me to get in the car and drive away. He was standing just a few feet away now, still too close. I hurriedly opened my car door, slid inside, and started to close it, but before I could, he placed his hand on the top of the door. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. "I just wanted to chat. You seem like someone I'd like to get to know." I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to engage with him anymore, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. He wasn't just some friendly stranger who wanted to talk, he was persistent, and it felt like he wasn't taking no for an answer. I pushed the door all the way closed and locked it. I could hear him still standing there, but I didn't look back. I started the engine and drove off quickly, not daring to look in my rearview mirror until I was a few blocks away. I couldn't stop shaking. The whole thing felt unreal, like some kind of nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. The guy was out there, and I had no idea why he was so determined to follow me, to talk to me, to get closer. I didn't go back to that store for weeks. Every time I passed it, I could feel the unease creeping up again. I kept thinking about how he just appeared when I was about to leave, how he was still standing there, watching. I've never had a stranger make me feel so trapped in my own skin before. It was a simple encounter, but it's something I'll never forget. Something about it stuck with me, and I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in that store again. I still don't know who he was, or why he chose me, but I'll always remember that feeling of being watched. It's one thing to feel alone, but it's another to feel like someone is always right behind you, waiting. I never thought this would happen to me. You always hear about it, people coming home to find their stuff messed with, things moved around, signs of someone having been in their home, but you never really think it'll happen to you. And when it does, you just freeze. It started like any other evening. I had been at work all day and was tired. My feet were sore from walking around, my mind was just ready to shut off for the night. I didn't think much of it as I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside. The smell of my apartment hit me first, the faint scent of the candle I had left burning earlier. But something felt off, like a weird stillness in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. I set my bag down by the door, kicked off my shoes, and glanced around. Nothing seemed too out of place. The living room was as I'd left it, couch cushions in the right spots, the TV remote on the coffee table. My kitchen was untouched. Still, there was something about it all that felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked down the hall to my bedroom and froze. The door was slightly ajar. I never leave it open. Not even a little. My heart started to race. I pushed the door open, expecting the worst. But everything seemed fine. Bed neatly made, clothes folded, nothing knocked over. But then I noticed something out of place. My bathroom door, which was always shut, was cracked open too. I stepped toward it slowly, dreading what I might find. The light was on inside, and I could see a shadow on the floor. I pushed the door open all the way, and that's when I saw it. There, on the floor, was a piece of clothing. A plain white t-shirt. Not mine. I stared at it for a second, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't a shirt I owned, and it definitely wasn't something I'd ever bought. I knelt down and picked it up, feeling the fabric. It was soft, clean. It hadn't been there before. But then I realized something even more unsettling. The bathroom mirror was slightly fogged, like someone had just used it recently. The towels were messier than usual, and the sink had a few water droplets on it. Someone had been in here. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I stood up quickly. My thoughts were spiraling. Was it a break-in? Maybe they took something, but I didn't see anything missing. I checked my wallet. It was still in my purse, in the same place it always was. My phone was there. My jewelry was untouched. I took a few deep breaths and tried to calm myself down. I should call the police. I should get out of the apartment and go to a neighbor's. But then I noticed something else. The closet door was open a little more than I ever left it. It was just enough for me to see a slight movement inside, like the way the door would shift if someone had just opened it and then quickly closed it again. I walked over, every step feeling like it was too loud, too noticeable, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached for the door handle, but my hand hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what I might find. Finally, I pulled the door open. At first, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. It was just my clothes hanging there, my shoes in their usual spots. But then I saw it, a pair of men's shoes on the floor, tucked behind my boots, hidden like they were meant to stay out of sight. They were dirty, scuffed. I reached down and touched them, my stomach flipping. I could hear my breath coming quicker now, feel the panic rising in my chest. I backed out of the closet slowly, feeling like I was losing my grip on everything around me. My mind was racing. Who had been here? How long had they been here? And, most importantly, why was I just finding out now? I turned to leave the room, but that's when I noticed the small stack of books on my desk. They weren't mine. I hadn't put them there, and I didn't recognize any of the titles. My heart started to beat harder in my chest. Whoever was here had been living in my space. They'd been in my bathroom. They'd been in my bedroom. My mind tried to reason with me. Maybe someone had just broken in, spent a little time here, but then left. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how intimate everything felt. I was sure someone had been living here. Someone who knew my habits, who knew my space. Maybe even someone who'd been watching me. I grabbed my phone with shaky hands and dialed the police. I gave them all the details, the weird clothing, the shoes in my closet, the books I didn't recognize. The dispatcher seemed calm, professional, telling me to stay in a safe place until officers arrived. I moved to the living room, locking the bathroom and bedroom doors behind me. I didn't want to go back in there. I didn't want to see any more signs that someone had invaded my privacy. I sat on the couch, the waiting feeling unbearable. About 20 minutes later, the police arrived. I let them in, showed them the apartment, explained everything. The officers took photos of the clothing, the shoes, and the books. They did a sweep of the apartment, checking the closets, the bathroom, under the furniture. One officer, a woman, asked me a few questions about whether I had noticed any strange people around or if anyone had been acting suspicious. I told her no. I was sure I didn't know this person. She told me they'd check for fingerprints and see if there were any signs of forced entry. But she also said it might be difficult to figure out who had been there, especially if they'd been careful. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for a few nights. My mind kept running through everything I had seen, wondering who could have been there. The police did an investigation, but nothing ever came of it. No leads. No suspects. No answers. I moved out of that apartment within the month. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been living in my space, breathing my air. I couldn't shake the idea that I was never truly alone in my own home. I never really thought about automatic car washes until it happened to me. I had just finished a long shift at work and figured I'd get my car washed before heading home. It wasn't the first time I'd been to this place, so I figured it would be a quick and easy stop. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, especially not what happened that day. The place was one of those drive-through automatic car washes, the kind where you just pull in, put the car in neutral, and let the machines do their thing. There were a few cars ahead of me in line, so I had to wait for my turn. Nothing unusual so far, just sitting there with the engine off, trying to kill time on my phone. Eventually, it was my turn, and I slowly pulled forward into the wash bay. I rolled my windows up, locked the doors, and set my phone down. I'd done this dozens of times before. The car wash started with the usual sounds, the rumbling of the machines, the whoosh of the water spraying down. I wasn't thinking about anything specific, I just sat there, watching the brushes move around my car. Then, just as the machines were about to start scrubbing the sides of the car, I felt a weird sensation. It was like I wasn't alone in the car. At first, I thought it was just the water hitting the windows and the noise of the machines, but something felt off. It was almost like someone was standing right outside my window. I turned my head quickly to the side, trying to shake the feeling. That's when I saw him. A man. He was standing at the driver's side of my car, looking directly at me. I couldn't make out much of his features, just a vague outline of his face and body. His face was pressed up against the window, and he was staring straight at me. It wasn't the kind of look you get from someone casually passing by, it was different. It was intense. Almost predatory. I froze. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. It didn't make any sense. The car wash was fully automated. No one was supposed to be outside the car, let alone that close to it. He didn't seem like an employee, and there was no reason for him to be standing there. I tried to ignore him, hoping he would just go away. I focused on the lights from the machines, the noise, anything to distract me. But then I saw it, his hand. He was trying to open the door. Slowly, carefully, as if he knew I was watching. His fingers wrapped around the door handle, and he pulled. I immediately locked the door again, but it was too late. My heart started pounding. I knew something was wrong. Who the hell was this guy? Why was he trying to get into my car? I looked around, but the other cars in the wash bay were too far away for anyone to notice what was going on. I was completely alone, stuck in the narrow passage with this man. I couldn't move. The car wash had already begun, and there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I looked at the rearview mirror, hoping to see anyone working the machines, but the wash was automated, and I didn't see anybody. The man's hand was still on the door handle. He was pulling again, this time more forcefully. I wasn't sure if he was trying to break in or just see if he could get it open. Either way, I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was in danger. Panic started to set in. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe properly. I started looking for my phone, but I couldn't find it right away. The machines were making so much noise, and I was so focused on what the man was doing that I couldn't think clearly. I finally grabbed my phone, but it took me a few seconds to unlock it. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. I dialed 911 as quickly as I could, but the call didn't go through right away. I could feel my heart pounding harder, louder in my chest. The man was still there, still tugging on the door, trying to get in. I could see his face now, his expression getting angrier, like he was frustrated that I wouldn't let him in. Finally, the call connected. The dispatcher asked what the emergency was, and I could barely get the words out. "Someone's trying to break into my car," I said, my voice trembling. I told them where I was, the address of the car wash. I could barely keep my thoughts straight. I didn't even know what to do anymore. The dispatcher told me to stay calm and keep the doors locked. She said someone would be there soon, but I didn't know if I could wait. The man hadn't stopped trying to get in. Every time I looked over, he was still there, trying the door handle, his eyes locked on mine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car wash machine started to wind down. The brushes stopped spinning, the water stopped spraying. I was almost done, and the car wash was over. The last thing I needed was for the door to open and the man to get inside. I wasn't sure if he would leave, or if he was planning to do something worse. But as soon as the wash was over and the machine stopped, I saw the man step back, just a few feet from my car. He didn't move toward the door again. He just stood there, staring at me. For a moment, we locked eyes, and I could see the anger in his expression. It wasn't just about getting into the car anymore. It was like he was angry that I hadn't let him in. Without thinking, I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the wash bay as quickly as I could. I looked behind me and saw the man standing there, still watching, but I didn't look back again after that. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands still shaking. The cops couldn't find the man when they checked the car wash, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I gave them a full description, but I didn't feel safe until I was home and locked inside my apartment. I haven't been to that car wash since. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But I learned a valuable lesson: never be too complacent. Even in the most routine, ordinary situations, you never know who might be watching. I was in the library that night, as usual, trying to get through a mountain of reading for my classes. It was around 10 p.m., and most people had already left. The library is open late, but it tends to get quiet after a certain hour. I like it that way. The atmosphere helps me focus better when I'm working. It was just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and a few others scattered around, sitting at their tables, probably doing the same thing as me, cramming for exams. I had my spot picked out in the back corner. It's a little secluded, which is perfect for me. I like the peace and quiet. I'd been there for a couple of hours already, my books and notes spread out, coffee beside me, trying to stay awake while studying for my final exam. My focus was on my notes, not really paying attention to the rest of the room. At some point, I felt someone sit down at the table across from me. It didn't bother me at first. It was a library, after all, and there were a few other people still there, too. But then I noticed this guy. He was older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, but I didn't think much of it. He didn't seem out of place at first. He just sat down and started reading a book, or at least pretending to. After a while, I felt his eyes on me. I tried to ignore it. Sometimes you just feel like someone's staring at you, but they aren't. It happens. But then it happened again. And again. And then I couldn't avoid it anymore. I looked up at him, catching his eye for just a second. He didn't look away. Instead, he smiled at me. It wasn't a big, friendly smile. It was more of a little smirk. I didn't know how to respond, so I just looked back down at my book, hoping he'd stop. But he didn't. He cleared his throat, and then he spoke, his voice low, almost too casual for how late it was. "You studying for something important?" he asked. I was a bit caught off guard but tried to stay polite. "Yeah, my final exam for philosophy," I said, not really wanting to get into it. But then he leaned forward slightly, making the space between us feel even smaller. "Philosophy, huh? That sounds tough. What's the hardest part about it?" he asked, as if he was genuinely interested. I thought it was odd that a random stranger in the library would ask me something like that, but I didn't want to be rude. "The theories, I guess. They get complicated. You know, figuring out what all these philosophers are really trying to say." He nodded like he was taking it all in, but then his question shifted. "Do you study alone a lot, or do you have a group?" He asked it in a way that made it sound like he was just making conversation, but something about the tone of his voice felt off. Like he wasn't really interested in my studies at all. "Mostly alone," I answered quickly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced around the library, looking for someone else, anyone else, to distract me from this weird conversation. There were a few people nearby, but no one seemed to notice what was going on. But he didn't seem to pick up on my discomfort. Instead, he leaned in just a little more, crossing his arms on the table. "You live alone?" he asked, his voice a little quieter, as if it was now something more personal than academic. I froze for a second. My mind raced, trying to come up with a polite way to get out of this conversation. But I didn't want to cause a scene. So I just nodded, trying to keep my voice even. "Yeah, I do." He stared at me, and there was something unsettling in his gaze. It wasn't the kind of look you get from someone who's just making small talk. It was too intense, too focused, like he was analyzing me. "That must get lonely," he said softly, his words lingering in the air between us. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet, hoping he would get the hint and leave me alone. But instead, he kept talking. "What's your name?" he asked. I hesitated, not wanting to give him too much information. But I didn't want to be rude either. So I gave him my first name, as if that was all he needed. "I'm John," he said, still watching me closely. There was a pause, and I could feel my heart start to race a little. The air between us felt thick, like something was about to happen. I could feel the weight of his gaze, and I didn't know what he was thinking. "I bet you've got some interesting things to say about life, huh?" he asked, and this time, his voice was even softer, almost like he was trying to get under my skin. It wasn't a casual question anymore. It felt like he was trying to pull something from me, like he was trying to make me feel like I owed him something. I felt like I needed to get out of there. I should get back to my studying," I said, pushing my books together. I stood up quickly, grabbing my things. But before I could turn away, he reached out and placed his hand on the table in front of me, just barely stopping me. "Come on, don't go yet," he said, his voice suddenly firmer. "I've got a few more questions for you. You can't just leave me hanging after all this." Something about his voice made the hairs on my neck stand up, and for the first time that night, I felt real fear. I looked around the library again. There were a few people still there, but no one seemed to be paying attention to us. The silence around us made everything feel so much worse. I really need to go," I said, my voice trembling just slightly. I took a step back, trying to move away from the table. But he didn't let go. His eyes narrowed. "You can't just walk away," he said, his voice low and cold now. "Not after you've been talking to me like this." I felt my heart race. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. I didn't know what to do. What if he followed me out? What if he didn't let me go? In that moment, I just knew I had to get away. Without thinking, I yanked my arm away from the table, grabbed my bag, and walked as quickly as I could toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't care if he was still watching me. I just wanted to get out of that library, away from him, as fast as possible. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift off my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my body. I didn't know if he was still in the library or if he followed me out, but I didn't look. I just walked straight to my car, got in, and drove home, barely remembering the drive. I didn't go back to that library for a while. Every time I thought about it, I felt sick. I couldn't shake the memory of his voice, his questions, the way he wouldn't let me go. It started as a normal drive. I had to head out of town for a work meeting, and since it was a long distance, I decided to use the GPS to make things easier. The route it gave me looked fine, a few rural roads here and there, but nothing that would raise any alarms. I'd been down these kinds of roads before, and I wasn't too worried about it. I'd been on the highway for about an hour, just getting into a quieter part of the countryside when the GPS instructed me to take a right turn onto a narrow road. The road was a little bumpy at first, and I thought maybe it was just a small stretch that would lead to a better road, but as I kept going, it became clear this wasn't the case. It was one of those old back roads with no streetlights, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick brush. The pavement was cracked and uneven, barely wide enough for 2 cars. But there were no signs of construction, no detours. It was just one of those forgotten roads that didn't seem to serve any particular purpose. I glanced at the GPS again. It showed that I was still on the right track, but the road seemed to get more desolate the further I went. The occasional farmhouse or old barn passed by, but there were no other cars. I felt a little uneasy, but nothing that would make me panic. I had driven in rural areas before. It was just a quiet part of the world, and I was probably overthinking it. About 10 minutes into this, I noticed a car behind me. It was a black SUV, not too far behind, but I hadn't heard it coming. I figured it was just another traveler, maybe going to the same place. The thing was, the car was driving much too close to mine. I thought about speeding up a little to give myself some space, but the road didn't allow for much room. There was barely enough space for 2 cars to drive side by side. I didn't want to make any sudden moves, so I just kept going, hoping the driver would eventually pull around me. But the car didn't pass. It stayed there, right on my tail, getting even closer. I could see the headlights in my rearview mirror, and it started to make me uncomfortable. It was getting late, and the road was getting narrower. I didn't know why this person was tailgating me. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would need to be that close, especially on a road this deserted. I tried to maintain my speed, but the car kept inching closer. It felt almost deliberate, like they were trying to push me to move faster. I glanced at the side of the road, but there was nowhere to pull over. It was just trees, ditches, and fields. My heart started to race. I didn't know why I felt so uneasy, but something about the whole situation was off. Then, without warning, the car behind me flashed its high beams. I jumped a little, startled by the sudden burst of light. The road was already poorly lit, and I couldn't see much ahead of me as it was. I squinted into the mirror, hoping the driver would back off. But instead, the SUV stayed right behind me, its lights blinding me now. It felt aggressive. like the person wanted me to pull over. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. What should I do? I couldn't stop in the middle of nowhere with this person right behind me. If I pulled over, would they stop too? Would they do something? I decided to speed up a little, hoping to get out of whatever this situation was. I hit the gas and pushed forward, but as I did, the SUV did the same. It accelerated, matching my speed, almost as if it was trying to push me further down the road. I made another quick check of the GPS. I was still on the right path, but there was no sign of a turn or any exit for several miles. My stomach dropped. This road seemed to go on forever. At that moment, the car behind me slammed on its horn, loud and sudden. It echoed through the trees, sharp and demanding. I wasn't sure if it was meant to scare me or force me into some kind of action, but I had to do something. I glanced to the side again, but there was still nowhere to go. Then it happened. The SUV moved to the side of my car, pushing just a little too close. I could see the black grille of the vehicle in my peripheral vision. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I couldn't speed up anymore, there wasn't enough room. Without warning, the SUV swerved in front of me, blocking my way. I slammed on the brakes, barely avoiding rear-ending them. The car in front of me slowed, almost stopping altogether. My hands were shaking as I slammed my hand down on the horn. I didn't know what they were planning, but this was clearly no accident. The SUV stayed there for a moment, as if waiting for me to make the next move. My mind raced. What should I do? I was trapped on this narrow road with no options. I was too far away from any towns, and there were no streetlights in sight. I couldn't just turn around, there wasn't enough room. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. Then, as I sat there, frozen for a second, the SUV suddenly sped off down the road, just as fast as it had appeared. It didn't stop to look back, didn't give me a chance to react. It was like they'd done what they needed to do, whatever that was, and then left without a word. I stayed there, my car still idling, my mind racing. What just happened? I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like I couldn't get air in my lungs. I kept thinking about the whole thing, the aggressive tailgating, the sudden maneuvering. It didn't make any sense. They could have passed me. They didn't need to get that close. After what felt like an eternity, I started the car again, keeping my eyes on the road. The SUV was nowhere in sight. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, my thoughts swirling with confusion and a lingering sense of danger. I finally reached the main road, where the streetlights were bright, and everything felt safer. But the image of that SUV, the way it moved and the way it forced me off the road, stayed with me. I still don't know what it was all about. Was it just some road rage incident? Or was there something more? What would have happened if I hadn't been able to slow down in time? To this day, I don't take those back roads anymore. I'm not sure what it was, but I still get this uneasy feeling every time I drive through unfamiliar areas. The whole thing was too close to something bad happening, and I can't shake the feeling that I dodged something dangerous that day. The train car was mostly empty. It was late, past midnight, and I was heading home after a long shift. I liked riding the train at night, it was quiet, and I could finally let my mind wander. There were only a handful of people scattered around the car, all lost in their own worlds. A man with headphones a few rows ahead of me, a woman in a corner seat scrolling through her phone, and another man sitting diagonally across from me with a notebook in his lap. At first, I didn't notice him. I was staring out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks against the darkness. But something pulled my attention back. The sound of a pen scratching paper. Not unusual, but it felt persistent, deliberate. I glanced over and saw him hunched over the notebook, his hand moving quickly. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with unkempt hair and a faded jacket. Nothing about him stood out, but the way he was focused on that notebook made me curious. I shifted in my seat to get a better look, but he turned the page before I could make out what he was drawing. His eyes flicked up and met mine for a split second before dropping back down to his notebook. Something about that glance made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing. People draw in public all the time. Maybe he was an artist, or just someone passing the time. But then I noticed something strange. The angle of his notebook was tilted toward me, like he wanted me to see but also didn't. It felt intentional. I turned my attention back to the window, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But I couldn't ignore it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him lift his head again, his gaze settling on me before quickly looking away. When the train slowed at the next station, I made a decision. I grabbed my bag, stood up, and moved to the next car. It wasn't far, just through the connecting doors, but it felt safer putting some distance between us. The new car was even emptier, just one man in a suit sleeping against the window. I took a seat near the middle, where I could see both exits. The train jerked forward, and I leaned back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then the door at the end of the car slid open. I looked up and felt my stomach drop. It was him. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around like he was deciding where to sit. He walked straight down the aisle and took a seat a few rows behind me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my head, and my hands clenched around the strap of my bag. I told myself I was imagining things. He could have just been moving cars for the same reason I had. Maybe he wanted more space, or maybe he didn't like the vibe in the last car. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. The train stopped again, and I decided to test it. I stood up, walked to the door, and stepped into the next car. This one was brighter, with more people. A couple chatting quietly, a man reading a book. I sat near the door, keeping my eyes on the connecting passage. It didn't take long. A minute later, the door slid open, and he stepped through. His eyes scanned the car until they landed on me. He didn't even pretend to look for another seat. He just sat down, closer this time, just 2 rows behind me. My heart was pounding now. I fumbled with my phone, opening a message thread and typing out a quick text to my roommate. There's a guy following me on the train. What do I do? I hit send and waited, staring at the screen like it was a lifeline. She didn't reply right away, and I didn't know if she was asleep or if the message hadn't gone through. The train rattled on, the hum of the tracks filling the silence. I could feel his gaze, even though I didn't turn around to check. The next station came into view, and I made a split-second decision. When the doors opened, I stepped off the train. I didn't plan to leave, I just wanted to see if he would follow. The platform was empty except for a janitor sweeping near the stairs. I stayed close to the edge, watching the doors. For a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong, that he would stay on the train and this would all just be a weird story to laugh about later. But then he stepped off. He stood on the platform, his notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't approach me, didn't say anything, just stood there watching. The doors closed behind him, and the train pulled away, leaving us in silence. I backed toward the stairs, my pulse racing. Can I help you? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then he opened the notebook and turned it toward me. The pages were filled with sketches. My face, my posture, even the way I had been sitting by the window. Page after page, all of me. I felt frozen, my legs refusing to move. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, closed the notebook, and took a step forward. I bolted. My legs finally worked, and I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I didn't look back until I reached the street, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. When I turned, he wasn't there. The platform was empty, the station eerily quiet. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station a few blocks away. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, breathless and disheveled. "Call the police," I said, my voice cracking. "There's a man following me." They came quickly, but by the time they searched the station, he was gone. I filed a report, described him as best as I could, but they didn't seem hopeful. "These things happen," one of the officers said, like it was supposed to make me feel better. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. It's been weeks, and I can't stop thinking about that notebook. About how many sketches there were. About how long he must have been watching me. I still take the train, but never alone. And I always sit near the conductor's car, where there are people around. But every time I hear the sound of a pen scratching paper, I feel my chest tighten, and I can't help but look over my shoulder. I've been running the same route for years. It's early mornings, just after sunrise, when the streets are still empty and the air is cool. I like the peace of it, the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, my breathing in time with the steady beat of my heart. There's something soothing about being alone with my thoughts. But that morning, everything changed. I was on my usual route, heading down a quieter stretch of the park, when I saw him. He was standing by the sidewalk, looking down at something in his hands. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People are always walking or sitting, especially around the park. As I got closer, he lifted his head and looked right at me. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice a little too loud for the stillness of the morning. I slowed my pace just slightly, not wanting to come off rude, but I wasn't in the mood to stop. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my pace up. I wasn't planning on engaging much. "Do you know where the nearest gas station is?" he asked, still standing in the same spot. His hands were shaking slightly, like maybe he was cold or nervous. His clothes were ragged, nothing that screamed normal. Just a plain hoodie and worn-out jeans, nothing remarkable. "Ah, yeah. Just keep going down the street and turn left at the next light," I said, not wanting to be bothered. I started to pick up speed again, hoping that would end the conversation. But he didn't move. "Actually," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm kind of lost. Do you know if there's a bus stop around here?" At this point, I was slowing down, not sure how to handle it. He wasn't exactly threatening, but something about his demeanor felt off. He was too still, too intense. And the fact that he hadn't moved from his spot told me something wasn't right. "There's a bus stop about a block away," I said, not breaking stride, trying to give a quick answer and move along. But he wasn't letting up. Can you help me find it?" I stopped. Not fully, but enough that I could look at him. There was something in his eyes, something desperate, almost pleading. The sun was starting to rise higher, casting a warm light on everything around, but I felt a chill run through me. He was standing too close, now taking a step toward me. "I don't know if I can." "I'm just running," I said, my voice tight. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck in a situation where I felt unsafe. He didn't seem to understand. Or maybe he didn't care. "I just need help," he said, his voice quieter now, more insistent. "I'm really lost. It's really important." There was a pause. He seemed to be waiting for something. I felt my chest tighten. My instincts told me to go, to move, to get away, but I stayed. I wanted to be polite. I wanted to help, but something in me screamed to walk away. Still, I wasn't sure what to do. I stood there for a second, trying to find the right words, but the moment felt strange, heavy. He was looking at me like he was waiting for me to do something. "I really need to find it." "You're not going anywhere, right?" he asked. "What?" My heart skipped a beat, and I suddenly felt very exposed. He had no business asking me that. No business asking me anything anymore. I took a quick step back. "I've got to go," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I turned and began jogging again, but before I could even get a few paces away, I heard his footsteps behind me. Heavy and deliberate. Not the quick, light footfalls of someone who's just out for a morning jog like me. I could feel his presence closing in behind me. I picked up the pace, trying to put distance between us, but he matched it. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it now, he was following me. I looked over my shoulder. He was maybe 10 feet away, and he wasn't slowing down. His pace was steady, determined. And now I was scared. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice coming out shaky even though I didn't want it to. He didn't answer. He just kept following, keeping that distance, like he was toying with me. I rounded a corner, hoping to lose him, but when I glanced back again, he was still there, just behind me. His gaze never left me. A sudden panic flooded me. I knew I couldn't outrun him for long, and I didn't want to go any further into the park. It was too isolated, too empty. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even have my phone with me. There was a bridge ahead, a small overpass that led to a busier street. I made up my mind and began running hard, faster than I'd ever run before, trying to reach that bridge. The sound of his footsteps grew louder behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I made it to the bridge, and for the first time, I risked a glance behind me. He was still there, maybe 20 feet back. But something had changed. The look in his eyes was more urgent now, like he realized he'd almost lost me. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I ran as fast as I could, toward the main road where there were cars, people, life. I couldn't risk staying in that park, not with him so close. I made it to the main street and kept going until I reached a convenience store. The door was unlocked, and I rushed inside, breathless, shaking. I looked out the window, but he didn't follow me any further. He had stopped just at the entrance to the park, watching me. And then he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I stayed inside for a while, unsure of what to do. I didn't call the police because I couldn't explain it. Nothing had really happened, right? He hadn't hurt me. He just followed me, made me feel like prey. But it was enough to make my heart race even now, days later. I don't know what his intentions were, but I know one thing. I've never run that route again. It happened about a year ago, but I still think about it all the time. I had just turned 18 and was looking for extra cash. I was babysitting a little girl who was 6, I think, and her parents were nice enough. It was a simple job. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, and it wasn't far from my own place. I'd watched their daughter a few times before, so I was comfortable. The parents were going out to dinner, and everything was going fine. The little girl was watching some cartoons, and I was sitting on the couch with my phone, scrolling through some stuff. Around 8:30, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I figured maybe it was a neighbor or someone on the street who needed something. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there. He was maybe in his late 40s, a bit rough around the edges, wearing a worn-out jacket. He didn't seem like a threat, not at first. He looked at me and said, "Hey, I'm a friend of the family. I just need to talk to them for a minute." His voice was calm, but something about it made me feel uneasy. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just his face. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either, just flat. I told him the parents weren't home. He didn't really react to that. He just stood there for a second, then smiled slightly, a little too wide. "Are you sure?" he asked. There was something about the way he said it that made me feel like he wasn't just asking if the parents were home. It felt like he was asking if I was sure about something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told him again that they were out and that they'd be back soon. He looked over my shoulder into the house, but I didn't open the door all the way, just enough to talk through it. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my pulse picking up. It was a weird feeling, like I was suddenly aware that I was alone in the house with this guy standing there. He looked at me again and said, "I'll just wait then. I'll wait inside, it's no trouble." That's when something inside me clicked, and I knew I didn't want him in the house. I was supposed to be watching this little girl, and I didn't know who this man was. He didn't belong here. I didn't want to be rude, but I was getting nervous. "Sorry, I can't let you in," I said. "I'll call them for you if you'd like." He paused, and I could see him thinking. Then he said, "I'm sure they won't mind. I'm a friend. I've known them for years." His eyes moved to the side, like he was trying to look past me, but I didn't let him. I shook my head. "I'm really sorry. I'm just going to call them." I tried to sound as firm as I could, but I could feel my voice wavering. Before I could close the door, he quickly said, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I'll just wait here. No need to be like that." His tone was different now, more insistent, like I had done something wrong. I immediately shut the door, locked it, and leaned back against it. My heart was racing. I didn't know what was wrong with him, but I knew something was off. I grabbed my phone and called the parents. They were only supposed to be gone for another hour or so, but I needed to check with them. I called twice, but neither of them answered. I left a message, saying I needed to talk to them about something. I felt my stomach twist. While I was waiting, I peeked through the curtains to see if the man was still there. He was standing on the porch, just looking down at the ground. I couldn't tell what he was doing, but he wasn't leaving. After a while, he knocked again, but I didn't answer. I just stayed still, hoping he would go away. Finally, the parents called me back. I told them about the man at the door, and they didn't seem to know who he was. I could hear the confusion in their voices. "Are you sure?" the mom asked. "We don't have anyone visiting tonight." I told her exactly what he said, that he was a friend of the family, and she didn't recognize the name he mentioned. They told me to stay inside and lock all the doors. I didn't need to be told twice. I moved quickly to double-check the locks on all the windows and doors. I don't think I've ever been more aware of how alone I felt in that house. I stayed near the little girl, who was still on the couch watching TV. I kept the volume low so I could hear anything that happened outside. The man knocked again, this time louder, and then started calling out, "Hey, I just want to talk to them. I'm not going to hurt you, I just need to talk to them." But he wasn't speaking with any kindness anymore. There was something in his voice, something cold that made me shiver. I didn't respond. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. I stayed quiet, hoping he'd give up and leave. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him walking away. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't hear any more knocks. I waited for a few minutes, making sure he was really gone before I dared to go to the door and check. When I opened the door just a crack, I saw him. He was standing at the end of the driveway, just looking back at me. He didn't wave or anything. He just stood there, his back to me, watching me from a distance. I closed the door quickly. I didn't know if he'd come back. I didn't know if he had any other reason for being there. But he didn't return, and when the parents got home, I told them everything. They said they didn't recognize him, but they called the police just in case. The police came and took a report, but nothing ever came of it. I don't know what he wanted or why he came to the house that night, but I don't think I'll ever forget the way his eyes looked when he was standing on the porch, and the way his voice changed when he insisted I let him in. I never babysat for that family again. It's been over a year, but I still get nervous when someone knocks at my door late at night. I don't know what would have happened if I'd opened it again. It started a week ago, but I still can't get the images out of my head. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. I had surgery. Nothing too serious, just a routine procedure, but it left me needing a few days of recovery at the hospital. My doctor assured me that everything would be fine. It wasn't a big hospital, not the kind you see in the city, but one of those smaller ones that's out in the country, more isolated. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the staff are familiar with every patient that walks through the door. I wasn't worried. After the surgery, I was groggy, mostly asleep, and I didn't notice much. But I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, and I realized something was off. My room felt different. The lights were dim, but the place felt too quiet. Too still. At first, I thought maybe it was just the after effects of the anesthesia, but as I looked around, I realized something wasn't right. There was someone sitting at the far side of the room, near the window, just staring at me. I couldn't make out the details, but I could see the shape of a person hunched over, their face in shadows. My heart raced, and I tried to sit up, but the pain from the surgery shot through my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the person didn't answer. They just sat there, motionless. My throat was dry, and I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I thought maybe it was a nurse or someone from the hospital just checking in on me, but the silence was unnerving. After a few moments, the person shifted slightly. I could make out the faint outline of handcuffs on their wrists. That's when the panic set in. I was alone with someone who had been restrained. That's when I heard a faint shuffle and the jangle of metal. I tried to call out again, but nothing came out. My throat was too dry. I could barely move, still recovering from the surgery, and now my mind was racing with questions. Why was someone in handcuffs here? Why hadn't anyone told me about this? The person moved slightly. I could feel my heart in my throat as I watched the shadows. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear the faint clink of metal every time they shifted in their seat. I needed help. I needed to get out of there. My instinct was to press the nurse call button, but when I reached for it, I realized the cord had been cut. That's when I started to panic. I tried to look around the room, my vision still blurry from the meds, but the silence was suffocating. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The door to my room, which was supposed to be locked for safety, was ajar. And that's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps approaching. My blood ran cold. I tried to force myself to stand, but the pain from my stitches was too much. Every movement felt like my body was on fire. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound that would indicate help was near. The footsteps stopped. The person at the window was still, but I could sense their attention shifting. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, but I couldn't make myself look directly at them. My breath was shallow now, and I realized the situation was far worse than I had initially thought. Whoever this was, this person locked up and sitting in my hospital room wasn't supposed to be here. That's when I heard the voice, low and gravelly. It was like a whisper, but it carried enough to send a chill down my spine. "Stay quiet," the voice said, barely above a whisper. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to call for help, but I knew it would be useless. There was no one coming. I was alone. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The silence was unbearable. My only focus was the handcuffs, the metallic sound, the person in my room. My thoughts raced through possibilities, none of them good. Then it happened. The lights went out. The whole hospital went dark, and all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat and the distant hum of the emergency generator kicking in. The power failure was brief, just long enough to leave the entire building in pitch black darkness. It was enough to make everything seem even more sinister. I could hear the person standing up now, moving in the dark, footsteps coming closer. I felt my entire body freeze in terror. Then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the floor reached my ears, and the person moved closer. "Stay down," they whispered again, this time with a little more force. I barely had time to react before the door to my room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. Someone entered, loud, deliberate footsteps. It was one of the police officers, and I couldn't tell whether they were here to help or if they were part of what was going on. "Is everything okay in here?" the officer asked, voice heavy with suspicion, but he didn't come into the room. The person in the shadows, the one in handcuffs, spoke again, their voice shaking slightly now. "Get me out of here," they demanded, not in a whisper this time. Their voice was more commanding, urgent. "I can't do that," the officer responded, his tone firm but unsure. "You're not going anywhere." For a moment, the room was still. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward. There was a scuffle. The sound of metal clanging, followed by a scream. I couldn't see anything. I was paralyzed, trapped in the bed, too terrified to move. I heard the officer shout, then a gunshot. The crack of it echoed through the room, but the silence that followed was worse than anything. I could feel something was wrong, but I couldn't see anything. My mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The officer came in finally, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I saw him kneeling beside me. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. I was moved quickly after that, taken to another room. The doctor came in to check on me, but I was still too disoriented to make sense of it all. Later, I learned the full story. The person who had been in my room wasn't just any criminal. They were violent, dangerous, and had been caught on charges I didn't want to know. The officer had been keeping them in my room by mistake. They'd been placed in the wrong ward. The power outage had been the perfect opportunity for them to escape, except they didn't expect the officer to intervene. But by then, it was too late for me. I couldn't erase the memory of that night, the feeling of being trapped in a room with someone who should never have been there. It took weeks for me to feel safe again. And I still don't trust hospitals. The whole thing still feels unreal. But it happened, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. A few friends and I had decided to go camping, just the 5 of us. We picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The weather was supposed to be perfect, cool but not too cold, with clear skies and sunshine. But by the time we set up our tents, the clouds had started to gather, and by the evening, the rain had come. At first, it wasn't anything too serious. Just a light drizzle. We didn't think much of it. We made a fire, cooked some food, and talked well into the night. As the evening went on, the rain began to fall harder, but we all thought it was just a passing storm. By the time we finished eating and cleaned up, the rain had turned into something more serious. The sound of the rain hitting the tent grew louder, and the wind started picking up. It wasn't just a storm anymore. I remember lying in my tent, listening to the downpour, the rain drumming on the roof of the tent like 1,000 tiny hammers. I tried to sleep, but the noise and the way the wind howled around us made it impossible. Every so often, I could hear a tree creaking, and I wondered if one of them would fall. The storm was getting worse, but there wasn't much we could do about it. We were stuck out there. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to something worse. It was the sound of water. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but the sound grew louder. The rain wasn't just falling anymore, it was rising. I could hear the rush of water outside, and it didn't take long for the panic to set in. We were in a low-lying area, and the ground around us was starting to flood. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The rain hit me like a slap to the face. The ground was already turning into mud, and I could hear the rushing of water all around us. The stream we had crossed earlier in the day was now a fast-moving river. It had swollen up so quickly, and it was moving so violently that I knew we couldn't wait much longer. We needed to get out. I woke the others up. They were groggy and confused, but when they saw what was happening, panic set in fast. We all scrambled to gather our things, flashlights, the car keys, anything we could grab, but the rain was relentless. The floodwaters were rising quickly, and there was no way we could stay there much longer. As we made our way to higher ground, the rain got heavier. It felt like the world around us was closing in. We moved as quickly as we could, but the ground was getting slick, and the water was rising faster than we expected. At one point, I slipped and almost got swept away. My feet were moving, but the ground was so slippery it was impossible to keep my footing. "We need to go," Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the storm. She was panicking, her eyes wide as she scanned the water, looking for a way out. "I'm trying," I shouted back. "We just need to find somewhere safe." It was so dark, and the rain was coming down so hard that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. The others were close behind, but I could hear the rushing water all around us, and the wind howling like it wanted to tear everything apart. We reached a small rise in the ground, and we all paused, catching our breath. We were standing in what used to be a clearing, but now the water was ankle deep, swirling around our feet. We were no longer just running from the rain, we were fighting the storm and the flood. "Where's Ben?" Sarah asked suddenly, looking around. He was right behind me. I turned and looked. Ben wasn't there. I could see him just moments ago, moving quickly toward the rise, but now, nothing. I called his name, my voice drowned out by the rain and wind. "Ben. Ben." No answer. My heart began to pound. "Ben." I called again, more urgently this time. But nothing. No response. I turned to the others, panic creeping into my chest. He was right behind me. "Where is he?" "We need to keep moving," Danny said, his face pale in the dim light. "We can't stay here." "But we can't leave him," I said, my voice shaking. I couldn't believe he had disappeared. He couldn't have just vanished. He was with us seconds ago. "We need to go," Sarah repeated. "We don't have time." I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to believe that Ben was gone. But the water was rising. It was getting harder to stand. The trees around us were bending in the wind, and I could feel the earth shifting under my feet. We were running out of time. "I'll go back for him," I said, but Danny grabbed my arm, stopping me. "No, you'll get yourself killed. We need to go." It felt like everything was slipping out of control. I didn't know what to do. The storm, the flood, everything was happening so fast. We had to make a choice, stay and look for Ben, or keep moving and hope we could find safety before it was too late. We made the decision to leave. We moved as quickly as we could, but the floodwaters were rising even faster now. The mud sucked at our boots, and the ground beneath us felt like it was sliding away. We had to scramble to keep moving. Every so often, I looked back, hoping to see Ben running toward us, but he never appeared. It was hours before we finally made it to the main road. By then, the floodwaters had started to recede, but the storm was still raging. We stumbled out onto the road, exhausted, cold, and soaked to the bone. The sound of the rain pounding the earth was deafening, but at least we were out of the woods. We never found Ben. We waited for hours, hoping he would show up, but he never did. We called his phone. No answer. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the water had already begun to subside. They searched, but nothing. It's been months now. I still don't know what happened to him. The last time I saw him, he was just a few feet away, but when we turned back to look for him, he was gone. There's no explanation. Nothing made sense. We thought we were all going to make it out together, but Ben didn't. I still don't know if it was the flood that took him or something else. I keep hearing his voice in my head, calling out to me, but every time I turn around, there's nothing there. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the image of him disappearing into the storm. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. I don't know what made me go out there that night. I wish I hadn't, but I did. I can still feel the weight of it when I think back. The rain was coming down hard, pounding against the windows like it had something to prove. The wind howled, and I could hear the trees outside creaking and bending with the storm. I was alone at the time, just trying to relax after a long day, curled up on the couch with a book. The only light came from the dim glow of the lamp beside me, and it was quiet, save for the sound of the rain. Then, I heard it. A noise. At first, I thought it was just the storm, maybe the wind making something rattle, but then I heard it again. It was faint, almost muffled, but there was no mistaking it. The sound of something scraping against the shed in my backyard. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. It was late, and I hadn't heard anything earlier. The shed had always been just a place to store old garden tools and things I never used, but in that moment, it seemed so much more ominous. I tried to tell myself it was just a storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noise came again, a scraping sound, followed by something heavier, like a footstep. It was clear now, someone or something was out there. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but I didn't. I don't know why, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the thought that if I made that call, I'd seem foolish. Who would be outside in this weather? Who would be in my shed? But then the idea settled in my mind. What if someone was breaking in? What if they needed help? The thought of someone being hurt, someone in distress, kept me from just running back into the house. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, wrapped myself in my raincoat, and headed outside. I stepped out into the yard, my boots sinking into the soggy ground. The rain felt cold against my skin, but it didn't matter. My heart was racing in my chest. I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the shed, my hands shaking. The beam flickered at first, but then it steadied, cutting through the darkness. The shed stood at the far end of the yard, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I knew someone or something was out there. I took a few steps forward, the wet grass slick underfoot. I was just about to reach the door of the shed when I heard the noise again. This time, it was a thud. It made me jump, and my grip on the flashlight tightened. The door to the shed was slightly ajar, not enough for someone to get out, but enough for me to see a sliver of movement inside. I hesitated. I almost turned back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I pulled the door open, and the hinges squeaked loudly in the still night air. The shed smelled of old wood, damp and musty, and I had to squint in the dim light of my flashlight to make out anything. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Is someone in here?" There was a moment of silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the roof, but then, just as I thought maybe I was imagining things, I heard it. A soft, strained voice. It came from the far corner of the shed, barely above a whisper. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was weak, but it was real. I took a cautious step forward, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There, in the corner, I saw movement. A figure hunched down, its head bent, shoulders shuddering. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were sitting on the floor, almost curled up in a ball. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's going on?" There was a long pause before the figure responded, but when they did, it was in a low, raspy voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "I need to stay here. Please. Don't make me leave." I stood there, staring at the shape in the corner, trying to make sense of what was going on. I had so many questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. Who was this person? How had they gotten in? Why were they hiding in my shed in the middle of a storm? "What do you mean? What are you doing here?" I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they shifted in place, and I heard the scrape of metal on the floor. My flashlight flickered again, and I realized they were holding something in their hand, something long and metallic. A knife, maybe? The fear that had been building inside me turned to panic. I should have run, I should have turned and left the shed, but for some reason, I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the figure straightened up. "You have to help me," they said, their voice now louder, more urgent. "I can't go back. Please. I can't go back." I had no idea who they were or what they were talking about, but I knew I couldn't stay. Something was wrong. It felt wrong. This was no stranger asking for help. This was something else, something darker. I turned to leave, my heart racing in my chest, when the figure suddenly moved toward me. They stumbled, dragging themselves across the floor. I was too slow to react, and before I knew it, they were standing in front of me, blocking the door. "You can't leave. I need you to stay," they said, their voice now frantic, desperate. I didn't have a choice. I was trapped in the small shed, the door behind me blocked. My only option was to get past them. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing my phone, but before I could pull it out, the figure lunged. I don't know how I did it, but I pushed them back with all my strength. They stumbled, and for a split second, I thought I might have a chance. Without thinking, I bolted out the door and into the rain. I didn't look back, not once. I didn't stop running until I was inside the house, locking the door behind me. I called the police right away. When they arrived, they found nothing in the shed. No person, no evidence of anyone being there. But they did take a report. They checked the area, but they didn't find anything suspicious. They said I must have imagined it, that the storm was playing tricks on my mind. I haven't been able to shake the feeling, though. Every time it storms, I hear that voice in my head. Please, don't make me leave. It doesn't go away. Whoever that person was, and whatever they wanted, I don't think they were really asking for help. And that thought still haunts me every time the rain starts to fall. It happened on a Friday evening. I had just put my son to bed, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I had ordered some things online earlier that week. Maybe it was a late delivery. I got up and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a brown jacket holding a small box. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but he smiled when I opened the door, keeping the chain latched. Delivery 4. He glanced at a piece of paper in his hand. Mrs. Taylor? The name was wrong, but I figured maybe it was a mix-up with the delivery company. I think you've got the wrong house, I said. He chuckled nervously. Sorry about that. Could you just confirm the address? That's when I started to feel uneasy. The box didn't have a label on it, and he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform. I asked him which delivery service he was with, but he avoided the question, mumbling something about working with a third-party company. I don't think that's for me, I said, starting to close the door. His hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the door before I could shut it. Wait, he said, his tone changing. I think this might actually be for you. I froze. His smile was gone, and his grip on the door was firm. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm. Let go of the door, I said, trying to sound confident. Instead of listening, he pushed against the door, hard enough to rattle the chain. I leaned my weight against it, but I could feel him testing it, trying to force it open. I just need to come in for a second, he said. His voice was steady, almost too calm, and it scared me more than if he'd been yelling. I'm calling the police, I said, backing away from the door and grabbing my phone off the table. He stopped pushing and looked straight through the gap. You won't, he said, his voice low and even. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. I dialed 911 anyway, but before I could hit call, he slammed his shoulder into the door. The chain held, but it groaned under the pressure. I screamed, dropping my phone, and ran to grab the baseball bat I kept in the corner of the living room. Stop it! I yelled, holding the bat in front of me like a shield. He didn't respond. The chain snapped with a loud crack, and the door flew open. He stepped inside, shutting it behind him, and for a second, we just stared at each other. He wasn't tall or particularly muscular, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He looked determined. I don't want to hurt you, he said, raising his hands like he was trying to calm me down. Just stay quiet, and this will be over soon. Get out of my house. I screamed, raising the bat. He lunged at me before I could swing it, grabbing my wrists and forcing the bat out of my hands. I struggled against him, kicking and clawing, but he was stronger than he looked. He shoved me against the wall, pinning me there. Where's the kid? He asked, his breath hot against my face. I froze. Leave him alone, I said, my voice shaking. His grip tightened, and he smiled with this slow, deliberate grin that made my skin crawl. That's up to you. I knew I couldn't let him near my son. I'd die before I let that happen. Gathering every ounce of strength I had, I kneed him in the groin as hard as I could. He let out a grunt and stumbled back, giving me just enough time to grab the bat from the floor